Texas, winter of 1880. The cold cut through bone like a dull knife, relentless and unforgiving. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, blanketing the rolling hills in pristine white, that belied the harshness of frontier life. On a small rise behind a weathered cabin, a solitary figure knelt before two wooden crosses, his broad shoulders hunched against the biting wind. Thornton Garrick brushed snow from the smaller of the crosses, his calloused fingers lingering on the rough-hewn wood. The name Matthew Garrick had been carved with painstaking care, each letter a testament to a father's love. Beside it stood another cross, slightly taller, bearing the name Sarah Garrick. 3 years today. Thornton whispered, his breath forming clouds that disappeared into the darkening sky. I kept my promise. I stayed until now. From the pocket of his worn coat, he withdrew a Colt revolver, its metal cold against his skin. He turned the gun over in his hand, studying it with the familiarity of a man who had carried such weapons through the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. His blue eyes, once vibrant with life, now appeared faded and hollow, like those of a much older man, though he was only 42. "Won't be long now," he murmured to the crosses. The bitter winter wind howled through the bare branches of nearby trees, sounding almost like a woman's cry. Thornton closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the gun in his hand. With deliberate slowness, he raised the Colt to his temple, the barrel pressing against gray-streaked hair, once the color of wheat. His finger tightened on the trigger. One small movement, and it would be over. The loneliness, the guilt, the memories that haunted his every waking moment and invaded his dreams. One small movement, and he would join Sarah and Matthew, fulfilling the promise he'd made on that terrible day when fever had taken them both within hours of each other, of each. The wind rose to a shrieking pitch, and somewhere in the distance Thornton heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A pounding, rhythmic and desperate. It pulled at his consciousness, demanding attention. His finger eased off the trigger. The sound came again, more insistent this time. It was coming from the direction of his cabin. Someone was at his door. For a moment, Thornton considered ignoring it. Whoever it was would soon give up and move on, leaving him to finish what he had started. But something about the desperate cadence made him lower the gun. "Just one more day," he whispered to the graves. "I'll join you tomorrow, Sarah. I promise." He tucked the Colt back into his coat pocket and stood, his bad leg stiff from kneeling in the cold. An old war wound, a bullet that had shattered his right knee during the Battle of Chancellorsville. Just one of many scars he carried, though not nearly the deepest. Thornton made his way down the hill, limping slightly, as he always did when the cold settled into his bones. The cabin came into view, a simple structure of rough-hewn logs that he had built with his own hands after returning from the war. It had once been filled with laughter and warmth. Now it stood as silent as a tomb, save for the persistent knocking that drew him forward. As he approached, he noticed fresh tracks in the snow leading to his door, already being obscured by the falling flakes. Someone had struggled to reach his isolated homestead in the middle of a blizzard. Thornton felt a flicker of annoyance. Tomorrow would have been perfect, clean, final. Now this stranger was interrupting his plans. He reached for the door, one hand instinctively moving to rest on the revolver in his pocket. Living alone on the frontier had taught him caution, and the war had taught him that danger could wear many faces. The pounding had grown weaker, barely audible above the howling wind. Thornton unlatched the door and pulled it open, letting in a swirl of snow and bitter cold. Huddled on his doorstep was a figure so covered in snow and frost that for a moment Thornton couldn't tell if it was a man or woman. Then the figure looked up, and he found himself staring into a pair of dark eyes, set in a copper-brown face framed by long black hair crusted with ice. A woman, an Indian woman. She wore nothing but tattered clothing that hung from her thin frame like rags on a scarecrow. Her lips were blue with cold, her body trembling violently. Yet despite her obvious distress, those eyes held something that caught Thornton off guard. Not the pleading desperation he might have expected, but a fierce determination that seemed to burn from within. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth. "One night, just until storm passes." Thornton stood frozen, his hand still on the gun in his pocket. An Apache woman, by the look of her. What was she doing out here alone in a blizzard, so far from any reservation or settlement? He should turn her away. His cabin was no sanctuary, and he was no savior. Not anymore. Not since he had failed to save his own family. Besides, tomorrow was the day he had planned to end it all. The last thing he needed was a complication. The woman swayed slightly clearly at the end of her strength. As she moved, her tattered sleeve fell away, revealing a pattern of scars across her forearm, the distinct marks left by a whip. Something long buried stirred in Thornton's chest, a feeling he thought had died with his family. "One night," he said gruffly, stepping back from the doorway. "You leave at first light." The woman nodded once and stumbled forward, collapsing to her knees just inside the threshold. Thornton closed the door against the howling wind and stood looking down at the stranger who had interrupted his appointment with death. For the first time in 3 years, Thornton Garrick had a reason to see the dawn. The fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls as Thornton stoked the flames, adding another log from the dwindling pile beside the stone fireplace. Behind him, the Indian woman lay wrapped in his only spare blanket, her breathing shallow but steady. She had passed out shortly after crossing his threshold, exhaustion and cold finally claiming her. Thornton studied her from across the room, keeping his distance. In the firelight he could better see her features, high cheekbones, a straight nose, lips cracked from exposure. Her black hair, now thawing, was long and straight, falling well past her shoulders. She was thin, too thin, but there was a wiriness to her frame that spoke of strength and endurance. Those scars on her arm bothered him. They weren't new. The skin had long since healed, leaving pale lines against her copper skin. But they told a story he had seen before during the war and after. The marks of ownership, of cruelty. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the unwelcome thoughts. It wasn't his concern. She would be gone in the morning, and he would return to the graves on the hill to finish what he had started. One day's delay changed nothing. "Sarah," he whispered to the empty room, "what would you have done?" He could almost hear his wife's gentle admonishment. She had been the kind one always ready to help a stranger, to offer food or shelter to those in need. Even during the war, when supplies were scarce and fear ran high, Sarah had never turned away anyone who came to their door, hungry or cold. Thornton moved to the small cabinet beside his bed and removed a battered tin cup. He filled it with water from the bucket he had brought in earlier and carried it to the woman's side. Kneeling awkwardly with his stiff leg, he set the cup within reach for when she awoke. As he straightened, the woman's eyes suddenly opened, dark and alert, despite her weakened state. She flinched away from him, one hand moving to her side, as though reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. "Easy," Thornton said, raising his hands to show they were empty. "You're safe for now." Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the rifle mounted on the wall, the single bed in the corner, and finally returning to Thornton's weathered face. "Water," he said, nodding toward the cup he had placed beside her. "Drink slowly." She hesitated, then reached for the cup with a trembling hand. bringing it to her lips with careful movements. After a few sips, she lowered the cup and looked directly at Thornton. "Thank you," she said, her English accented but clear. "Don't thank me yet," Thornton replied gruffly. "You're still leaving at first light." A ghost of a smile touched her cracked lips. "If I live that long." Something about her calm acceptance of possible death unsettled Thornton. It was too familiar, too close to his own state of mind. He turned away, moving back toward the fire. "What's your name?" he asked, not looking at her. A pause, as if she was deciding whether to tell the truth. "Nahimana," she finally answered. Thornton glanced back at her. "That's a mouthful." "It means mystic in my language," she said, taking another careful sip of water. "What do they call you?" "Thornton. Thornton Garrick." Nahimana nodded slightly, as though committing the name to memory. "You live here alone, Thornton Garrick." He stiffened. "Yes, but not always," she observed, her dark eyes moving to the small wooden toys gathering dust on a shelf, then to the woman's shawl still hanging on a peg by the door. Thornton felt a surge of anger. "That's none of your concern." Nahimana lowered her eyes. "I meant no disrespect. I am grateful for the shelter." Her sincerity deflated his anger, leaving behind the familiar hollow ache that never seemed to leave his chest. He grunted in acknowledgement and turned his attention back to the fire. "Rest while you can," he said. "Storm might break by morning." Nahimana settled back on the floor, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. In the flickering firelight, Thornton could see more scars peeking from beneath the collar of her tattered dress, evidence of hardships he could only imagine. As she drifted back to sleep, Thornton remained by the fire, watching the flames consume the wood. For the first time in years, he felt compelled to keep the fire burning through the night, to ensure that the cold would not claim this stranger who had appeared at his door like an apparition from another world. It was the first time since burying Sarah and Matthew that he had thought about keeping something alive. Dawn arrived shrouded in gray, the blizzard having softened to a steady snowfall that continued to blanket the landscape. Thornton had not slept. He'd spent the night in his chair, the Colt revolver resting on his knee, watching over both the fire and the woman called Nahimana. She had slept deeply, her body desperately reclaiming strength after what must have been days of exposure and exhaustion. Now, as pale light filtered through the cabin's small windows, Thornton rose stiffly from his chair, his joints protesting after hours of immobility. He added another log to the fire, then moved to the window, pushing aside the rough cloth that served as a curtain. The world outside was transformed, buried under at least 2 feet of fresh snow, with more still falling. His small barn was barely visible through the swirling white, the path to it completely obscured. The animals would need tending: his old mule, 2 horses, and the few chickens that provided eggs when the hens weren't too cold to lay. Behind him, Nahimana stirred, sitting up slowly. She looked better this morning, some color returned to her face, though her eyes still held the caution of one accustomed to danger. "Storm hasn't broken," Thornton said without turning from the window. "Snow's still coming down." Nahimana rose to her feet, keeping the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She joined him at the window, maintaining a careful distance. "I will go anyway," she said quietly. "I have taken enough of your hospitality." Thornton glanced at her, noting how the blanket dwarfed her thin frame. "You won't make it a mile in this weather dressed like that." "I have survived worse." Something in her tone made Thornton believe her, but it didn't change the facts. "Maybe so, but not today. Look out there. No tracks, no landmarks visible. You'd be lost before midday, frozen by nightfall." Nahimana's expression remained stoic, but he could see the conflict in her eyes. She clearly didn't want to impose yet. She knew he was right. "I must go," she insisted. "I cannot stay." "Why?" Thornton asked. "What's chasing you?" A shadow crossed her face. "Nothing that will come here," she said after a moment. "But I have somewhere I must be." Thornton was about to press further when a sharp pain lanced through his chest, radiating outward with such intensity that he gasped, one hand clutching at his shirt front. His vision blurred, dark spots dancing at the edges. It was an old, familiar pain, one that had been his constant companion since Chancellorsville. A bullet had lodged too close to his heart for the field surgeons to remove, and in cold weather it made its presence known with agonizing clarity. He felt himself stumbling, his bad leg buckling beneath him. Then surprisingly strong hands were guiding him to his chair, easing him down with unexpected gentleness. "Breathe slowly," Nahimana instructed, her voice calm but firm. "In through nose, out through mouth." Thornton tried to follow her direction, fighting against the vice grip of pain. Gradually the spasm eased, leaving him drained and sweating, despite the chill in the cabin. Nahimana watched him with knowing eyes. "Old wound," she stated rather than asked. Thornton nodded, still catching his breath. "War souvenir. Bullet near the heart. Doctors said taking it out would kill me faster than leaving it in." "And it pains you when the cold is deep," she observed. "Among other times," he admitted. "It's worse lately." Nahimana's gaze was disconcertingly perceptive. "Because you do not care to treat it anymore." Thornton looked away, uncomfortable with her insight. "Animals need feeding," he said, changing the subject. "Need to clear a path to the barn." He started to rise, but another milder spasm of pain made him wince and sink back into the chair. Nahimana regarded him thoughtfully. "You cannot go out like this. The animals will suffer." She moved to the door, dropping the blanket and replacing it with Thornton's heavy coat, which hung on a peg nearby. The coat engulfed her, the sleeves hanging well past her fingertips. "What do you think you're doing?" Thornton demanded. "I will tend your animals," she said simply. "Tell me what must be done." "You don't know the first thing about—" "I have cared for horses, cattle, even buffalo," she interrupted. "Tell me where to find feed, how much to give. I will do this while you rest." Thornton stared at her, torn between pride and practicality. The animals did need tending, and in his current state, he wasn't sure he could make it to the barn and back. "Grain's in the wooden bin against the wall," he said finally. "Half a scoop for each horse, quarter for the mule. Chickens get a handful of corn. Water trough needs breaking up if it's frozen over." Nahimana nodded, absorbing the instructions. "I will return soon." Before Thornton could offer further protest, she had slipped outside, disappearing into the swirling snow. Alone in the cabin, Thornton leaned back in his chair, his hand unconsciously moving to the pocket where the Colt resided. Today was supposed to be the day. The day he finally rejoined Sarah and Matthew. The day he ended the loneliness and pain that had become his entire existence. Instead, he found himself waiting for an Apache woman to return from caring for animals he had planned to abandon. Life, it seemed, had other ideas. Nearly an hour passed before the door opened again, admitting a snow-covered Nahimana and a blast of cold air. She stomped her feet to clear the snow, then hung the coat back on its peg. "Animals are fed," she reported. "Water trough was frozen. I broke ice filled with fresh water from well. Horses needed brushing, too much snow in their coats." Thornton nodded, grudgingly impressed. "Thank you." Nahimana moved to the fire, holding her hands out to the flames. "Your gray mare has a cut on her leg. Not deep, but needs cleaning." "Old Sally's always getting herself into trouble," Thornton muttered. "I'll see to it when—" Another spasm cut off his words, this one milder but still sharp enough to make him grimace. Nahimana watched him with those perceptive eyes. "You have medicine for the pain." Thornton hesitated, then nodded toward a small wooden box on the shelf. "Laudanum. Don't use it much. Makes my head foggy." She retrieved the box and brought it to him, then filled a cup with water. "Take it now. Rest. I will see to the mare's leg." Thornton looked up at her, suddenly suspicious. "Why are you helping me? What do you want?" Nahimana's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, a momentary glimpse of old pain quickly hidden away. "You gave shelter when I had none," she said simply. "I repay this debt." "And then you'll leave?" Thornton asked, unsure why the question felt important. Nahimana glanced toward the window where snow continued to fall heavily. "When storm ends," she agreed. "Until then, I help with animals with fire. You rest, heal." Thornton considered her proposal. It made sense in a practical frontier way. They would help each other survive the blizzard, then part ways. No complications, no attachments. And when she was gone, he could return to his original plan. "All right," he said finally. "Until the storm breaks." Nahimana nodded once, sealing their arrangement. "I will see to the mare now." As she donned the heavy coat once more and slipped out into the snow. Thornton uncorked the laudanum bottle and took a small sip, grimacing at the bitter taste. He had been sparing with the medicine these past months, knowing he wouldn't need it after today. Today, that was now postponed indefinitely. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the laudanum begin to dull the edges of his pain. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the path to the hill where Sarah and Matthew lay beneath their wooden crosses. It seemed even the weather conspired to delay his reunion with them. "Just a little longer," he whispered, his eyes growing heavy as the medicine took hold. "I haven't forgotten my promise." As he drifted into a fitful sleep, Thornton thought he glimpsed Sarah standing in the corner of the cabin, her face wearing the gentle, disappointed expression she'd had whenever he'd broken a promise to young Matthew. But before he could speak to her, darkness claimed him, and the vision faded like morning mist. The next 3 days passed in a strange, uneasy rhythm as the blizzard maintained its grip on the Texas hill country. Each morning, Nahimana would rise before dawn, tend to the animals, and return to prepare a simple meal from Thornton's meager stores. Each day, Thornton's chest pains would come and go sometimes, leaving him breathless and sweating, other times merely a dull ache that he could work through. They spoke little, existing in a careful dance of shared space, but maintained distance. Yet Thornton found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, noting the efficient way she moved, the quiet dignity she maintained, despite her circumstances, the way she seemed to make the small cabin less empty somehow. On the 4th day, as Nahimana was searching through Thornton's cupboard for coffee beans, she came across a small wooden box pushed to the back of the shelf. It fell as she reached for it, spilling its contents across the rough plank floor, several small brown bottles of morphine and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. Thornton, who had been cleaning his rifle at the table, looked up sharply at the sound. His eyes narrowed when he saw what had fallen. "Leave those be," he said, his voice tight. Nahimana was already carefully gathering the bottles, her expression neutral. "You have much pain medicine," she observed quietly. "That's my business," Thornton replied, setting down the rifle and moving to take the box from her hands. As he reached for it, Another spasm gripped his chest stronger than the previous ones. He gasped, staggering against the cupboard, knocking over a tin of flour that spilled white across the floor. Nahimana was at his side instantly, her small but strong hands guiding him to his chair. "Breathe," she instructed as she had before. When the worst had passed, she retrieved one of the morphine bottles. "This is stronger than laudanum. You need it now." Thornton shook his head, still catching his breath. "No, saving those. For what purpose you suffer needlessly?" He didn't answer, but something in his expression must have revealed more than he intended. Nahimana's dark eyes widened slightly, a new understanding dawning in their depths. "You save them altogether," she said softly. "For an ending." Thornton looked away, unable to meet her penetrating gaze. "Like I said, it's my business." Nahimana set the bottle on the table beside him, but didn't press him to take it. Instead, she knelt and began cleaning up the spilled flour, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "My people believe that how we leave this world is as important as how we live in it," she said after a while. "A warrior who chooses his end must be certain his journey is truly complete." "I'm no warrior," Thornton muttered. Nahimana glanced up at him. "The scars you carry say otherwise." Before he could respond, she rose and moved to the window. "Snow is less today. Perhaps storm will break soon." Thornton followed her gaze. The snow was indeed falling more lightly now, and patches of pale blue sky were visible between the clouds. A sign that the blizzard was finally losing its strength. "You'll be leaving then," he said, surprised by the flatness in his own voice. Nahimana didn't turn from the window. "Yes, when path is clear." Thornton nodded, though she couldn't see the gesture. It was for the best. She would go on her way, and he would return to his solitude, to his plans. Yet somehow the thought brought no comfort. Later that evening, as Nahimana prepared a simple stew from the last of Thornton's vegetables, he watched her from his chair by the fire. The cabin was warmer than it had been in months. The fire kept burning steadily throughout the day. The floor was swept, the shelves organized, his few dishes washed and stacked neatly. Small changes that made the space feel less like a tomb and more like a home again. As she worked, Thornton noticed her occasionally touching a small leather pouch that hung around her neck, her fingers tracing its outline beneath her dress. The gesture seemed unconscious, a habit born of long practice. "What's in the pouch?" he asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Nahimana's hand froze, then fell away from the hidden object. "A remembrance," she said softly. "Something precious." Thornton didn't press further, recognizing the boundaries of privacy, even in the confines of the small cabin. As night fell, Thornton found himself drifting in and out of a fitful sleep, dreams mixing with half-waking visions. Sarah appeared, as she often did, sitting on the edge of his bed, her golden hair illuminated by moonlight, her blue eyes sad as she watched him. "You promised," she seemed to whisper, though her lips didn't move. "You promised to join us." "I will," Thornton murmured, unsure if he spoke aloud or only in the dream. "Soon." Sarah's image wavered like a reflection in troubled water. "But you saved her," she said. "Why save her if you've given up?" Before Thornton could answer, the vision shifted, and he was back on the battlefield at Chancellorsville, the air thick with gun smoke and the cries of dying men. He was crawling through mud and blood, dragging his shattered leg behind him, searching desperately for something or someone. He awoke with a gasp, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the chill in the room. The fire had burned low, casting the cabin in deep shadows. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or what year it was, the dream still clinging to his consciousness like cobwebs. A soft movement caught his attention. Nahimana was up silently, adding wood to the fire. She glanced over at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Bad dreams," she said, not a question, but an observation. Thornton sat up, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Old ones." Nahimana nodded, understanding in her eyes. "The past does not die easily." "No," Thornton agreed. "It surely doesn't." She moved to the small table where she had left a cup of water, bringing it to him. As he took it, their fingers brushed briefly, the first direct contact since she had helped him to his chair days ago. "Your wife," Nahimana said quietly. "You see her still." Thornton nearly dropped the cup, startled by her perception. "How did you speak to her in your sleep," Nahimana explained. "You promised to join her." Thornton set the cup down, suddenly uncomfortable with her insight. "That's your business," she finished for him. "Yes, but death is patient, Thornton Garrick. It waits for all. There is no need to rush to meet it." She returned to her place by the fire, wrapping herself in the blanket he had given her that first night. In the flickering light, her profile was sharp and proud, revealing a strength that went beyond the physical. Thornton lay back down, turning his face to the wall. But sleep eluded him now, her words echoing in his mind. Death is patient. It waits for all. The next morning, he woke to find one of the morphine bottles missing from the wooden box. A quick search revealed that 3 more were gone as well. When he confronted Nahimana, she met his angry accusations with calm dignity. "You do not need them all at once," she said simply. "One is enough for pain." "They are mine," Thornton growled. "You have no right." "No," she agreed. "But I have seen too much death to help bring another." Her words struck him like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily speechless. Before he could recover and demand the return of his property, she had donned his coat and slipped out to tend the animals, leaving him alone with his anger and the uncomfortable truth she had spoken. Death is patient. It waits for all. The blizzard had finally broken, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. The temperature had risen slightly enough that the snow on the cabin roof had begun to melt, creating a steady drip outside the window. The path to the barn was now visible, tamped down by Nahimana's daily trips to tend the animals. Despite the improving weather, neither of them had mentioned her departure again. Each morning, Thornton expected to wake and find her gone, the borrowed blanket neatly folded, the cabin empty once more. Yet each day she remained tending the animals, preparing simple meals, maintaining a careful distance that was nonetheless closer than any human had been to Thornton in 3 long years. One evening, as they sat before the fire, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been, Nahimana began to speak, her voice soft but clear in the quiet cabin. "My people have a story," she said, her eyes on the dancing flames, "about how first man discovered fire." Thornton glanced at her, surprised. It was the first time she had volunteered information about her people or her past. "First man was cold and alone." Nahimana continued, her accented English taking on a rhythmic quality. "The world was new, and darkness was long. He wandered many days, shivering, hungry, afraid. Then one night he saw a star fall from sky. Where it touched earth, flames appeared." She made a graceful gesture with her hands, mimicking the falling star. First man was afraid of the bright flames, but cold was stronger than fear. He approached fire, felt its warmth. He learned to feed it with wood to keep it alive through night. Fire became his companion, drove away darkness, cooked his food, kept him warm. Thornton found himself drawn into the story despite himself watching the play of firelight across her copper features. But one day, First Man grew careless. He did not feed fire, did not watch over it. Fire grew small, then died. Darkness returned, and with it cold and hunger. First Man realized too late what he had lost. She paused, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. What happened then? Thornton asked, his voice rough from disuse. Nahimana looked at him, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. He had to search many days for another falling star. He learned that some things once lost are hard to find again. But when he found fire once more, he never took it for granted. He tended it, always remembering the long darkness. The simple story hung in the air between them, carrying more meaning than its words alone. "Your people have many stories like this?" Thornton asked after a while. Nahimana nodded. "Stories are how we remember who we are, where we came from. They teach without scolding guide, without forcing." "My wife used to tell stories," Thornton said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "To our son, every night before sleep." It was the first time he had spoken of Sarah and Matthew to Nahimana, though she had clearly deduced their existence. "What stories did she tell?" Nahimana asked gently. Thornton stared into the fire, memories washing over him. "Bible stories mostly. She was a God-fearing woman. But sometimes—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Sometimes she'd make up adventures. About a boy and his loyal dog exploring the frontier. Matthew loved those best." "How old was your son?" Nahimana's voice remained soft, non-intrusive. "6. Thornton replied, the single syllable laden with grief. "Just 6 when the fever took him. Took them both within a day of each other." Nahimana was quiet for a moment. "My people believe that those who leave this world do not go far," she said finally. "They walk beside us unseen but present. They guide us, protect us." Thornton gave a bitter laugh. "If that's true, they haven't been doing much guiding or protecting these past 3 years. And perhaps," Nahimana suggested carefully, "they wait for you to listen." Thornton looked at her sharply, but there was no judgment in her dark eyes, only a deep understanding that made him look away first. "Among my people," she continued, "we believe that the greatest dishonor to those who have gone before is to waste the life they can no longer live." Her words struck uncomfortably close to the truth Thornton had been avoiding. He stood abruptly, moving to the window to escape her perceptive gaze. "It's getting late," he said gruffly. "We should sleep." Nahimana did not press the point. She simply nodded and settled herself on her blanket near the fire, her back to him in a gesture of privacy. Thornton remained at the window for a long time, looking out at the moonlit snow, his thoughts in turmoil. The morphine bottles Nahimana had hidden were still missing his carefully laid plans, disrupted by her presence and now by her words. "The greatest dishonor to those who have gone before is to waste the life they can no longer live." Had he been dishonoring Sarah and Matthew all these years? The thought was almost too painful to bear. When he finally returned to his bed, sleep eluded him. In the darkness, he imagined he could hear Sarah's voice, not calling him to join her, as in his dreams, but telling one of her made-up stories about the boy and his dog. The adventures they had, the challenges, they overcame, the life they lived to the fullest. For the first time since their deaths, Thornton wondered if perhaps he had misunderstood what Sarah would have wanted for him. The next morning, Thornton woke to find Nahimana already gone, presumably to tend the animals. He rose stiffly, his chest aching with the familiar pain, but it seemed more distant today, less consuming. He moved to the small shaving mirror hanging on the wall, studying his reflection with new eyes. A stranger stared back at him, a man with a gray-streaked beard, grown wild, hollow cheeks, and eyes that had forgotten how to hope. He barely recognized himself. With a sudden decision, Thornton retrieved his straight razor from the shelf, testing the edge with his thumb. Then carefully, he began to shave away the beard that had been his only companion these past years. When Nahimana returned, stamping snow from her feet, she paused in the doorway, her eyes widening slightly at the transformation. Thornton stood before her, clean-shaven for the first time since burying his family, his hair combed back from his face. "The animals are fed," she reported, recovering her composure. "The path to the road is nearly clear." Thornton nodded, understanding the unspoken implication. With the weather improving and the roads becoming passable, there was no longer any practical reason for her to remain. "Thank you," he said the words, feeling inadequate. Then, before he could reconsider, he added, "There's coffee if you want some." It was a simple offer, but in the context of their careful coexistence, it represented something more, an invitation to stay, at least, for a little while longer. Nahimana studied him for a moment, then nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I would like that." As they sat at the small table, steam rising from their cups, Thornton found himself speaking again. "That story you told last night," he began, "about First Man and the fire. It reminds me of something Sarah used to say. 'Don't let the light go out, Thornton,' she'd tell me whenever I was brooding about something. 'Keep the fire burning.'" Nahimana nodded thoughtfully. "Your wife was wise." "Yes," Thornton agreed softly. "She was." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow across the snow-covered landscape. For the first time in 3 years, Thornton felt something stir within him that wasn't pain or grief. It was small and fragile, like the first green shoot after a long winter, but unmistakable. Hope. As January gave way to February, the bitter cold maintained its grip on the Texas hill country, but the skies remained clear, the blizzard a memory. The snow began to recede in places where the sun struck directly, revealing patches of dormant grass and frozen mud beneath. Nahimana had not left. Neither of them spoke of it directly, but each day she remained tending the animals, preparing meals, her presence gradually becoming a part of the cabin's rhythm rather than an interruption to it. Thornton found himself emerging from the fog of grief that had enveloped him for 3 years, noticing things he had long ignored, the way the morning light created patterns on the cabin wall, the comforting sounds of another human moving about the small space, the satisfaction of completing simple tasks that had once seemed pointless. One morning, as he chopped firewood behind the cabin, a familiar pain gripped his chest, sharper than it had been in weeks. He dropped the axe, clutching at his shirt front, as he staggered against the woodpile. His vision darkened at the edges, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He was dimly aware of Nahimana appearing at his side, her small, strong hands guiding him to sit on the chopping block. Through the haze of pain, he heard her speaking, her voice calm and steady. "Breathe slowly," she instructed. "In, hold, out." Thornton tried to follow her guidance, fighting against the vice-like grip around his heart. Gradually, the pain receded, leaving him weak and sweating despite the cold. "Inside," Nahimana said, helping him to his feet. "You need medicine." She led him to the cabin, easing him into his chair by the fire. From a small pouch at her waist, she withdrew a handful of dried herbs and added them to a cup of hot water from the kettle. "Drink," she said, holding the cup to his lips. "It will help with pain." The liquid was bitter but not unpleasant, with hints of mint and something earthier beneath. Thornton drank obediently, too drained to argue. "What is it?" he asked when he had emptied the cup. "Medicine from my people," Nahimana replied, setting the cup aside. "For heart pain." Thornton leaned back in his chair, feeling the herb tea spread warmth through his chest, dulling the edges of the pain. "Where did you learn this?" "I was healer for my village," Nahimana said, her eyes on the fire rather than on him. Before. It was the first direct reference she had made to her life before arriving at his door. Thornton sensed the weight behind that single word before. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Nahimana remained silent for so long that Thornton thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, tinged with old pain. "Soldiers came," she said simply. "Many men with guns and hate in their eyes. They burned lodges, killed many. Those who lived were taken." The familiar weight of guilt settled on Thornton's chest, heavier than the pain of his wound. He had been one of those soldiers once, following orders to pacify native settlements. He had seen the aftermath of such raids, the smoldering remains of homes, the bodies left unburied, the survivors herded like cattle onto reservations. "I'm sorry," he said, the words woefully inadequate. Nahimana glanced at him, her dark eyes unreadable. "You were soldier," she stated rather than asked. Thornton nodded slowly. "Yes, in the war between states and after." "After," she repeated, understanding dawning in her eyes. "When you fought my people." "Yes," Thornton admitted, unable to look at her. "I was part of a unit that patrolled the Western Territories after the war. We were ordered to clear land for settlers." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Thornton waited for her anger, her accusation, her departure. She would be right to leave now, to hate him for what he had been part of. Instead, Nahimana moved to the window, her back to him as she spoke. "There are wounds that do not bleed," she said softly. "Wounds that no medicine can heal." Thornton knew she spoke not only of herself, but of him as well, of the invisible wounds they both carried from different sides of the same conflict. "I know," he replied. She turned to face him, her expression grave but not hateful. "What is heaviest on your heart?" "Thornton Garrick, what wound festers beneath your skin?" The question struck deep, piercing defenses long maintained. Thornton felt a pressure building in his chest that had nothing to do with the bullet lodged near his heart. "I couldn't save them," he said, his voice breaking. "Sarah and Matthew. The fever came so fast. I rode for the doctor, but the river was flooded. By the time I got back..." He swallowed hard. "They were already gone. I wasn't there when they needed me most." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and painful. But there was more, a deeper truth he had never spoken aloud, had barely acknowledged even to himself. "And in the war," he continued, the words forcing themselves out, "there was a village. Apache, I think. We were ordered to clear it. The captain said they'd attacked a stagecoach, killed settlers. But when we got there..." He paused, the memories surfacing like bodies from a lake. "There were only women and children, old men, no weapons beyond hunting bows." Nahimana stood perfectly still, her eyes never leaving his face. "I knew it was wrong," Thornton said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I didn't stop it. I stood by while my unit..." He couldn't finish the sentence, shame closing his throat. "You watched them die," Nahimana said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "As you watched your family die. Helpless both times." Her insight was so accurate that Thornton could only nod, a single tear escaping to track down his weathered cheek. "These are the wounds that do not heal," she said, moving closer to him. "The wounds we carry in silence." To his surprise, she knelt before him, taking his rough hands in her smaller ones. "My people believe that speaking pain aloud robs it of power," she said. "That sharing burden makes it lighter." Thornton looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and calloused from years of hard work, and war, hers smaller but no less marked by hardship. In that moment, something shifted between them, a new understanding born of shared pain. "I dream of them," he admitted. "The people from that village. They stand with Sarah and Matthew watching me, waiting for me to join them, to pay for what I did, for what I didn't do." Nahimana's grip tightened slightly. "The dead do not seek payment, Thornton. They seek peace, for themselves and for those they leave behind." "How can you know that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because I too have carried such dreams," she said softly. "I too have seen the faces of those I could not save." She released his hands and stood moving to retrieve something from the small bundle of possessions she kept wrapped in a piece of cloth. When she returned, she held out a small object, a carved wooden figure of a woman, simple but beautiful in its execution. "My mother made this," she said, placing it in his palm. "Before soldiers came, she gave it to me for safekeeping. I could not save her, but I saved this. A small piece of her life, her work." Thornton cradled the carving carefully, understanding the preciousness of this artifact from a destroyed world. "We honor the dead not by joining them before our time," Nahimana continued, "but by carrying what they gave us, by living as they would wish us to live." Her words resonated with what Sarah had always told him: "Keep the fire burning, Thornton." "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "You already have begun," Nahimana said, gesturing around the cabin. "You shaved your beard. You chop wood. You speak of your family with love instead of only grief. The fire is small, but it burns." Thornton looked up at her, seeing not just an Apache woman who had appeared at his door in a blizzard, but a fellow survivor, someone who understood his pain because she carried her own. "Thank you," he said simply. Nahimana nodded, accepting his gratitude with dignity. "Rest now," she said. "The medicine will help you sleep without dreams." As she moved away to tend the fire, Thornton leaned back in his chair, the wooden carving still in his hand. The herb tea was indeed making him drowsy, but for the first time in years, he didn't fear the approach of sleep and what dreams might come. That night, as a light snow fell outside the cabin, Thornton slept deeply and without nightmares. When he woke in the pale light of dawn, he felt different, as though something heavy had been set down, a burden he had carried for so long he had forgotten it wasn't part of him. The bullet was still near his heart. The grief for his family still lived within him, but the poison of unspoken guilt had been drawn out, leaving space for something else to grow. February progressed with alternating periods of thaw and freeze, the landscape transforming daily as winter maintained its grip but showed signs of eventually relenting. Inside Thornton's cabin, a similar transformation was taking place, subtle but undeniable. The space that had once been merely a shelter, a place to wait for death, was becoming a home again. Nahimana had sewn new curtains from an old shirt, repaired the loose floorboard by the door, organized the shelves that had long stood in disarray. Thornton found himself making small improvements as well, fixing the leaky roof, crafting a better chair for the table, clearing the path to the graves on the hill, so he could visit Sarah and Matthew without the conversation being one of apology and promises to join them. One evening, as snow fell gently outside, Thornton sat at the table with the Bible Sarah had treasured, its leather binding worn from years of daily reading. Nahimana was darning a sock by the fire, her nimble fingers working with practiced ease. "Would you like to learn to read?" Thornton asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Nahimana looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "You would teach me." "I'm no schoolmaster," Thornton said with a shrug, "but I know my letters." Sarah always said everyone should be able to read the good book for themselves. Nahimana set aside her darning and approached the table. "I would like to learn," she said, her voice soft but eager. Thornton opened the Bible to the first chapter of Genesis, pointing to the words as he read aloud. "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." Nahimana leaned closer, her brow furrowed in concentration as she followed his finger across the page. Her hair, which had grown longer since her arrival, fell forward, brushing against Thornton's arm. The unexpected contact sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with his chest wound. "These marks are words?" she asked, seemingly unaware of his reaction. "Letters," Thornton explained, regaining his composure. "They make up words when put together, like this one." He pointed to God. "God, God." Nahimana nodded thoughtfully. "In my language, we have no such marks. Our stories are kept here." She touched her head. "And here." She placed her hand over her heart. As she made the gesture, Thornton noticed again the small leather pouch that hung around her neck, partially visible beneath her dress. He had seen her touch it often, a seemingly unconscious habit, in moments of reflection or distress. "That pouch," he said, nodding toward it. "You wear it always. Is it important to you?" Nahimana's hand moved instinctively to cover the hidden object, her expression closing slightly. "Yes," she replied simply. Thornton sensed her reluctance, but pressed gently. "What's inside, if you don't mind my asking?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, with deliberate movements, she withdrew the pouch from beneath her dress and untied the leather thong that sealed it. From inside, she carefully removed a small object wrapped in a scrap of soft buckskin. Unwrapping it, she revealed a lock of black hair bound with a thin strip of sinew. "My daughter's hair," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "All I have left of her." Thornton felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. "Your daughter," Nahimana rewrapped the lock of hair with reverent care, her eyes distant with memory. "Halona," she said, the name like a prayer on her lips. "It means of happy fortune. She was 5 summers old when they took her." "Who took her?" Thornton asked, though a sickening certainty was already forming in his gut. "Soldiers," Nahimana replied, her voice flat. "After they burned our village. The women who lived the children they separated us, took children to school far away, took women to work in houses of white men or—" She paused, her hand unconsciously moving to the scars on her arm. "Or worse," Thornton finished, for her understanding all too well the fate of many captured native women. Nahimana nodded once, her expression carefully controlled. "I escaped after 2 years. Have been searching for Halona since, following rumors, stories of schools where they take our children to make them forget who they are." The revelation hung heavy in the air between them. Thornton felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Sorrow for her loss, admiration for her determination, and shame for the role his people, perhaps even men under his command, had played in such separations. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling hollow against the magnitude of her loss. Nahimana tucked the pouch back beneath her dress, her fingers lingering on it briefly. "Each day I pray she remembers me, remembers our ways, our stories." "How long has she been gone?" Thornton asked gently. 3 years, Nahimana replied. She would be 8 summers now, if she lives. And you've been searching all this time? Yes, working where I can, following every whisper, every story of schools with Indian children. Her dark eyes met his, unwavering in their intensity. I will find her, Thornton, or I will die trying. The determination in her voice left no room for doubt. In that moment, Thornton understood why she had fought so hard to survive the blizzard, why she had hidden his morphine bottles, why she spoke of honoring the dead by continuing to live. She had a purpose that transcended her own suffering, a mission that gave meaning to each day of survival. I believe you will, he said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Nahimana studied him for a moment, then returned to her place by the fire, picking up her darning once more. But something had shifted between them, a new layer of understanding, of shared vulnerability. Thornton returned his attention to the Bible, but the words blurred before his eyes. His thoughts were filled with the image of a young Apache girl, torn from her mother's arms, sent to a distant school to have her identity, her culture, her very self erased and remade in the image of the conquerors. How many such separations had he witnessed during his time in the army? How many had he facilitated believing the government's assurances that it was for the best, that civilizing the native children was an act of charity rather than destruction? The weight of complicity pressed on him anew, but this time, instead of crushing him with guilt, it kindled something different. A desire to make amends, however small or symbolic the gesture might be. Nahimana, he said, looking up from the Bible. I want to help you find Halona. She froze, the needle poised mid-stitch, her eyes lifting to meet his. Why? It was a fair question, direct and unadorned. Why would a former soldier, a man who had participated in the system that had taken her child, now offer to help undo that wrong? Because it's right, Thornton said simply. Because no child should be taken from their mother. And because... He paused, searching for words to express the change that had been slowly working in him since her arrival. Because you've given me back something I thought was gone forever. A reason to wake up each morning. Nahimana's expression softened slightly, a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. How would you help? I have contacts from the army days, Thornton explained, men who might know about these schools where they're located. And I have some savings, not much, but enough to travel if we get word of her whereabouts. The offer hung between them, sincere but fraught with implications. It would mean leaving the isolation of his cabin, re-entering a world he had withdrawn from 3 years ago. It would mean facing people, questions his own past. Nahimana set aside her darning and approached him once more. Her movements deliberate and graceful. She stopped before him, her dark eyes searching his face, as though seeking confirmation of his sincerity. Why would you do this? She asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. You owe me nothing. Thornton met her gaze steadily. Maybe I owe it to myself. To be the man Sarah always believed I was. The man I stopped being when I lost her. Nahimana considered this, then nodded once, accepting his reasoning. Thank you, she said simply. As she turned to go, Thornton caught her hand, surprising them both with the gesture. We'll find her, Nahimana. I promise. The words escaped before he could consider their weight, a promise made to this woman he had known for barely a month. Yet, as they hung in the air between them, Thornton realized he meant them with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. Nahimana's fingers tightened briefly around his, a silent acknowledgement of his pledge. Then she withdrew her hand and returned to her place by the fire, her face composed, but her eyes bright with an emotion Thornton couldn't quite name. Later that night, as Thornton lay in his bed, listening to the soft sounds of Nahimana's breathing from her pallet. Near the fire, he found himself thinking not of Sarah and Matthew waiting on the hill, but of a young Apache girl named Helona, somewhere out there in the vast expanse of Texas or beyond, perhaps looking at the same stars visible through his small window, perhaps wondering if anyone was searching for her. For the first time in 3 years, Thornton Garrick had made a promise to the living rather than the dead, and for the first time he felt the stirring of a long-dormant emotion, purpose. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the land in a blanket of white that obscured boundaries and erased differences, if only for a night. March arrived with warmer temperatures, melting much of the snow and turning the roads from impassable to merely difficult. The countryside began to show the first tentative signs of approaching spring. Early buds on the trees, patches of green appearing in sheltered spots, birds returning from their winter migrations. Thornton and Nahimana had settled into a comfortable routine, their initial wariness replaced by a quiet companionship born of shared purpose. Each day they worked side by side, tending the animals, repairing winter damage to the cabin, and outbuildings, preparing for the journey they would undertake once the roads were fully passable. In the evenings, Thornton continued Nahimana's reading lessons, marveling at how quickly she grasped the connection between letters and sounds, words and meanings. She was an eager student, her intelligence evident in the thoughtful questions she asked and the connections she made. One afternoon, as Thornton was repairing a broken hinge on the barn door, he heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching along the muddy road. Visitors were rare even in good weather. In the aftermath of winter, with the roads still treacherous, they were almost unheard of. He straightened, hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt, a habit from his solitary years. Shielding his eyes against the sun, he made out a solitary rider approaching at a steady pace, mounted on a fine black horse that spoke of wealth and position. As the rider drew closer, Thornton felt a jolt of recognition followed by a wave of unease. The visitor was no stranger, but a face from his past, one he had never expected to see again. Dr. Calvin Mercer, former Army surgeon, and the man who had told Thornton that removing the bullet near his heart would kill him faster than leaving it in. Mercer had been with his unit during those final months of pacification missions, treating wounded soldiers and occasionally the native prisoners they took. Thornton remembered him as a competent doctor, but a cold man, one who viewed the natives with a detached clinical interest that had always struck Thornton as somehow worse than outright hatred. Hatred at least acknowledged the humanity of its object. "Garrick, is that really you under all that sun?" Mercer called as he drew his horse to a stop before the barn. "I almost didn't recognize you without the beard." Thornton nodded stiffly, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Dr. Mercer, didn't expect to see you out this way." Mercer dismounted with the ease of a man accustomed to long rides, his tall, lean frame still straight, despite his 55 years. His hair had gone completely gray since Thornton had last seen him, but his eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles were as sharp and assessing as ever. "I've set up a practice in Austin," Mercer explained, removing his riding gloves, "but I still make rounds to the outlying areas when weather permits. Heard from Thompson at the general store that you were still holed up out here. Thought I'd check on that ticker of yours." He tapped his own chest, indicating Thornton's wound. "It's fine," Thornton said shortly. "No need to trouble yourself." Mercer smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "No trouble at all. I'm a Dr. Garrick. Checking on old patients is my duty." Before Thornton could object further, the cabin door opened and Nahimana emerged, likely drawn by the sound of voices. She froze when she saw the visitor, her body tensing visibly. Mercer's reaction was equally telling, a slight widening of the eyes, a momentary stillness before he composed his features, into a mask of polite surprise. "Well, well," he said, his gaze sliding from Nahimana to Thornton. "I see you have company. How unexpected." There was something in his tone that set Thornton's nerves on edge, a subtle undercurrent he couldn't quite identify. "This is Nahimana," Thornton said, moving slightly to position himself between Mercer and the cabin. "She's been helping around the place since winter." Mercer smiled thinly, his eyes never leaving Nahimana. "Has she indeed? How fortunate for you." Nahimana had not moved from the doorway, her expression carefully blank, but Thornton could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the doorframe. "Apache, if I'm not mistaken," Mercer continued, addressing the question to Thornton rather than Nahimana herself, as though she were an interesting specimen rather than a person. "Yes," Thornton replied, disliking the direction of the conversation. "Dr. Mercer was an army surgeon," he explained to Nahimana. "Treated my wound after Chancellorsville." Nahimana nodded once in acknowledgement, but said nothing, her dark eyes wary. "I treated many fascinating cases during my time with the army." Mercer said, his gaze still fixed on Nahimana with an intensity that made Thornton increasingly uncomfortable. "Including quite a few natives. Their physiological responses to trauma are quite remarkable." The way he said fascinating and remarkable made Thornton's skin crawl. There was an avid quality to his interest that seemed inappropriate, almost predatory. "Would you care for some coffee, Doctor?" Thornton asked, hoping to divert Mercer's attention. "It's been a long ride from town." Mercer finally turned his gaze back to Thornton, adjusting his spectacles. "Indeed it has. Coffee would be most welcome." Thornton gestured toward the cabin, and Mercer started forward. As they approached the doorway, Nahimana stepped aside to let them pass, her movements careful and controlled. Thornton noted that she positioned herself to avoid any contact with Mercer, maintaining as much distance as the narrow doorway allowed. Inside the cabin, Mercer looked around with undisguised curiosity, taking in the small improvements that had been made since Nahimana's arrival, the new curtains, the organized shelves, the general air of habitation rather than mere survival. "Quite cozy," he commented, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "I must say, Garrick, this is a far cry from the bachelor quarters I expected to find." There was an insinuation in his words that made Thornton bristle, but he kept his expression neutral as he moved to the stove to prepare coffee. Nahimana had followed them inside but remained near the door as though prepared for a quick exit if necessary. "So tell me," Mercer continued, settling himself uninvited in Thornton's chair by the fire, "how did you come to have an Apache assistant?" So far from any reservation, the pause before assistant was deliberate, suggesting he suspected a different arrangement. Thornton felt a surge of protective anger on Nahimana's behalf. "She arrived during the blizzard," he said, shortly setting the coffee pot on the stove. "Needed shelter. Stayed to help when she saw I was laid up with the chest pains." "Ah, yes, the pains." Mercer nodded, his tone becoming more professional. "Have they worsened? Any new symptoms I should know about?" "No worse than before," Thornton replied, grateful for the shift to medical matters. "And yet you look better than when I last saw you." Mercer observed, his sharp eyes assessing. "Cleaner, certainly. Less haunted." Thornton didn't respond to that, busying himself with measuring coffee into the pot. "Perhaps having company has been beneficial to your condition." Mercer continued, his gaze sliding back to Nahimana, who had moved to the table, maintaining her distance. "Native women are known for their therapeutic abilities." The insinuation was unmistakable this time, and Thornton felt his temper rising. Before he could respond, however, Nahimana spoke for the first time since Mercer's arrival. "I was healer in my village," she said, her English clear and deliberate. "Before soldiers came." Mercer's eyebrows rose slightly, either at her command of English or at her willingness to address him directly. "Is that so? How interesting. What manner of healing did you practice? Herbs, rituals, both, I imagine." His tone was that of a man indulging a child's fanciful story, patronizing and dismissive. But there was something else beneath it, a keen interest that seemed at odds with his affected superiority. "Many methods," Nahimana replied, her voice steady, despite her obvious discomfort. "What healing is needed?" Mercer leaned forward slightly, his eyes intent behind his spectacles. "I've always found native medicine fascinating. So, primitive, yet occasionally effective through sheer trial and error. I've conducted several studies on the subject." The way he said studies made Thornton uneasy. He remembered rumors from his army days about Mercer's unusual interest in native prisoners, his requests to have them transferred to his medical tent for observation. "Coffee's ready," Thornton announced, deliberately interrupting whatever Mercer had been about to say next. He poured 2 cups, bringing one to Mercer and keeping the other for himself. He noticed that Nahimana declined, with a small shake of her head, when he glanced questioningly in her direction. "Thank you," Mercer said, accepting the cup. He took a sip, then set it aside. "Now let me have a look at that chest of yours. It's been, 15 years since Chancellorsville? That bullet's been near your heart a long time." Thornton hesitated, reluctant to be examined in front of Nahimana, but equally reluctant to be alone with Mercer. There was something about the doctor that disturbed him now. In a way it hadn't during the war, perhaps, because he was seeing the man with new eyes, eyes that had begun to recognize the humanity in those Mercer viewed as mere subjects for study. "It's fine," Thornton repeated. "The pains come and go, same as always." Mercer's lips thinned with impatience. "Don't be stubborn, Garrick. I've ridden all this way. The least you can do is let me earn my coffee." With obvious reluctance, Thornton unbuttoned his shirt, exposing the puckered scar just below his left collarbone where the bullet had entered. Mercer approached his fingers, cool and impersonal, as they probed the old wound. "Breathe deeply," he instructed. Thornton complied, aware of Nahimana, watching from her position by the table, her expression unreadable. After a few moments of examination, Mercer stepped back, wiping his hands on a handkerchief he produced from his pocket. "No obvious changes," he pronounced. "Though without proper equipment, it's hard to determine the bullet's exact position after all these years. It could have shifted." "Feels the same," Thornton said, rebuttoning his shirt. Mercer didn't seem convinced. "I'd like you to come into Austin. Let me examine you properly at my clinic. I've acquired some remarkable new equipment, quite cutting edge." "I'll consider it," Thornton said, having no intention of doing any such thing. Mercer didn't press the issue, instead returning to his chair and picking up his coffee. His gaze drifted back to Nahimana, who had not relaxed her vigilant stance. "You speak English remarkably well," he observed. "Where did you learn?" Nahimana met his gaze steadily. "Missions, trading posts, listening. Self-taught, then impressive." Mercer sipped his coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "You know, I'm conducting research at a school not far from here. A place where native children are educated in the ways of civilization. Perhaps you've heard of it, the Wayward Creek Indian School." Thornton saw Nahimana's composure slip for an instant, a flash of recognition and fear crossing her face, before she controlled it. But Mercer had seen it too, his eyes narrowing slightly with interest. "Ah, you have heard of it," he said softly. "I thought you might have. It's quite well known among the local tribes. A beacon of progress, bringing the light of education to the unfortunate children of the wilderness." The mockery in his tone was subtle but unmistakable, as was the threat behind his words. He knew something about Nahimana, or suspected it, and was toying with her like a cat with a mouse. "I think it's time you were on your way, Doctor," Thornton said, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "The roads will be difficult to navigate after dark." Mercer smiled thinly, clearly aware that he had struck a nerve, but willing to retreat for now. "Of course, you're right." He rose, retrieving his hat from the peg by the door. "But do consider coming to Austin Garrick. That bullet won't wait forever." At the doorway he paused, turning back to fix Nahimana with one last penetrating look. "Perhaps you could accompany him," he suggested. "I'm sure you'd find my clinic educational, and I have many colleagues who would be fascinated to meet a self-taught Apache healer." The implied threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Then Mercer was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded more ominous than a slam would have. Through the window, Thornton watched him mount his black horse and ride away, his straight-backed posture never wavering as he disappeared down the muddy road. Only when Mercer was completely out of sight did Thornton turn to Nahimana. She stood rigid by the table, her face composed, but her eyes ablaze with an emotion he hadn't seen in her before, pure, undiluted fear. "You know him," Thornton said, not a question but a statement. Nahimana's hands were trembling slightly, the only outward sign of her distress. "Yes," she whispered. "He is the one who bought me when soldiers took our village." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Thornton felt sick as understanding dawned. "Bought you as a slave, as a specimen," Nahimana corrected, her voice bitter. "For his studies, to observe how native bodies respond to pain, to cold, to hunger, how quickly we heal from different wounds, how much we can endure before we break." Thornton sank slowly into a chair, horrified by the calm way she described such atrocities. "My God," he breathed. "And Helona, taken to his school." Nahimana's composure cracked slightly, her voice catching. "With other children, to be civilized." "The Wayward Creek Indian School," Thornton said, remembering Mercer's words. "That's where she is." Nahimana nodded her hand, moving to the leather pouch at her neck. "I have searched for 2 years, following rumors, stories. I knew she was in a school, but not which one. Not until now." Thornton saw her expression shift from fear to determination, watched her gather herself, straightening her shoulders as she made a decision. "I must leave," she said. "Tonight. He will come back now that he knows I am here." "Wait," Thornton said, rising quickly. "We need to think this through. If you run now, he'll know something's wrong. He might alert the authorities, have them looking for you." "I cannot stay," Nahimana insisted. "He will take me back, use me for more studies." The way she said the word made Thornton's blood run cold. He had seen the aftermath of battles, had watched men die in agony, but the clinical cruelty Nahimana described was something else entirely, a deliberate, systematic torture disguised as scientific inquiry. "We'll go together," he decided. "But we need supplies, a plan. We need to know more about this school before we try to find Helona." Nahimana hesitated, clearly torn between the instinct to flee immediately and the recognition that Thornton was right. "How?" she asked finally. "How do we learn more?" Thornton thought for a moment, his mind working through possibilities. "Thompson at the general store. He hears everything that happens in the county. And my old Sergeant Jenkins settled about 20 miles south of here after the war. He might know something about Mercer's current activities." Hope flickered in Nahimana's eyes, but caution quickly tempered it. "Mercer will be watching now. He suspects I am looking for her." "Then we'll be careful," Thornton promised. But we won't run blindly. That's exactly what he'd expect. Nahimana studied his face, searching for something reassurance, perhaps, or confirmation of his commitment. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. 2 days, she conceded, to prepare to learn what we can. Then we go whether we have a plan or not. Agreed, Thornton said. He held out his hand, a gesture of partnership, of shared purpose. After a moment's hesitation, Nahimana took it, her smaller hand warm and firm in his. In that moment, as their hands clasped in silent promise, Thornton felt the last of his death wish slip away, replaced by something stronger, a fierce determination to right at least one of the many wrongs he had witnessed, had been complicit in during his years as a soldier. For the first time since burying Sarah and Matthew Thornton, Garrick had something to fight for, something more than mere survival. He had a cause, a purpose, and though he knew the bullet near his heart could claim him at any moment, he no longer yearned for that end. Now he had a reason to live. The morning after Mercer's unwelcome visit dawned clear and mild, the countryside awakening to early spring's tentative embrace. Birds called from budding trees, and the muddy earth steamed gently in the morning sun, frost giving way to green possibility. Inside the cabin, Thornton and Nahimana worked with quiet urgency, preparing for a journey neither had anticipated just a day before. The doctor's visit had changed everything, transforming their vague intentions into immediate necessity. "We'll need food for at least a week," Thornton said, sorting through his supplies. "Hardtack, jerky beans, coffee. The roads are still bad in places, might take us 3 days just to reach Wayward Creek." Nahimana nodded efficiently, packing the items he indicated into a pair of worn saddlebags. Her movements were precise, but betrayed an underlying tension, a barely contained urgency that vibrated through her like a plucked string. "Thompson's store first," Thornton continued, checking the condition of his old army revolver. "He'll have news, maybe details about the school, then south to Jenkins. If anyone knows Mercer's business, it'll be him." "What if Mercer has already spoken to these men?" Nahimana asked, her voice steady, despite the fear Thornton knew she must be feeling. "What if they warn him of our questions?" Thornton considered this, running a hand through his hair. "Thompson's no friend to Mercer, too honest by half. And Jenkins—" He paused, remembering his former sergeant, a hard but fair man who'd grown increasingly troubled by their unit's actions against the natives. "Jenkins left the army because of men like Mercer. He won't betray us." Nahimana accepted this assessment with a nod, though her eyes still held doubt. She had learned the hard way not to trust the promises of white men, even those who seemed different from the rest. As she continued packing, Thornton noticed her pause, her hand going to the small leather pouch at her neck, the one containing her daughter's hair. It was a gesture he'd seen many times now, a touchstone that seemed to renew her resolve in moments of uncertainty. "We'll find her," he said quietly. Nahimana looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "Yes," she agreed. "Or die trying." The simple conviction in her voice struck Thornton deeply. Just weeks ago, he had been ready to end his life out of grief and guilt. Now he was preparing to risk that same life for a purpose beyond himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. By midday, their preparations were complete. 2 horses stood saddled outside the cabin, Thornton's reliable bay gelding Thunder and the older gray mare Sally that Nahimana had tended during the blizzard. Thornton made a final check of the cabin, securing what few valuables he possessed, then paused at the small shelf that held the wooden toys he had carved for Matthew. After a moment's hesitation, he took one, a little horse, its features worn smooth from a child's hands, and slipped it into his pocket. Outside, Nahimana waited beside the horses, her few possessions already packed, her face composed, but alert. She wore Thornton's old coat, several sizes too large but sturdy against the spring chill. Her long black hair was braided and coiled at the nape of her neck, practical for the journey ahead. "Ready?" Thornton asked, securing the cabin door behind him. Nahimana nodded once, then surprised him by saying, "Should we visit their graves to say goodbye?" The suggestion caught Thornton off guard. In the rush of preparation, he hadn't thought to visit Sarah and Matthew on the hill, a ritual that had been as regular as breathing for 3 years. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I'd like that." They left the horses tethered and walked together up the gentle slope to where 2 wooden crosses stood against the sky. The winter snow had melted here, revealing tufts of early grass and a few hardy wildflowers just beginning to bloom around the grave markers. Thornton knelt, brushing his fingertips across the names carved into the wood. "Sarah," he said softly. "Matthew, I'm going away for a while, to help someone find their child." He glanced at Nahimana, who stood respectfully a few paces back. "I think you'd approve, Sarah. You always said no child should suffer if we could prevent it." Nahimana stepped forward, her movement hesitant but deliberate. From a pouch at her waist, she withdrew a small bundle of herbs tied with sinew. She placed it carefully between the 2 crosses, then spoke in her native language, the words flowing like water over stones, musical and reverent. When she finished, she looked at Thornton. "I asked them to watch over us on our journey," she explained, "and to know that you honor them by helping a mother find her child." Thornton felt a tightness in his throat at her gesture, a simple kindness that acknowledged the importance of what and whom he was leaving behind. "Thank you," he managed. They stood together for a moment longer, the spring breeze stirring the new grass around the graves. Then, with a final nod of farewell, Thornton turned away, Nahimana at his side. As they mounted their horses and set out along the muddy road toward town, Thornton felt a curious lightness despite the gravity of their mission. For the first time in 3 years he was leaving his property, not for necessities or grudging social obligations, but for a purpose that stretched beyond his own grief. It felt like drawing a full breath after years of shallow breathing. Beside him, Nahimana rode with the natural grace of one raised on horseback, her posture straight, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead. The urgency of their mission thrummed between them, unspoken but palpable. They had 2 days to gather information, to plan, to prepare for whatever awaited them at Wayward Creek. 2 days to give Halona's mother a chance to reclaim her child. 2 days before the hunt would surely begin in earnest. The road stretched before them, winding through greening hills toward an uncertain fate. Behind them, 2 wooden crosses stood silent on a hill, witnesses to a promise made and a journey begun. Thompson's General Store sat at the dusty crossroads that constituted the nearest semblance of a town to Thornton's isolated cabin. A weathered 2-story building with a wide front porch, it served as merchant post office and social hub for the scattered homesteaders and ranchers of the county. As Thornton and Nahimana approached, Thornton noted with unease the black horse tethered outside Mercer's Mount, unmistakable with its fine bloodlines and expensive tack. The doctor had clearly wasted no time in continuing his business in the area. "Wait here," Thornton murmured, raining thunder to a stop 100 yards from the store. "He might recognize Sally. She's distinctive with that white blaze." Nahimana nodded, guiding the gray mare into a stand of trees beside the road, effectively concealing herself from casual observation. "Be careful," she said, her eyes serious. "He is clever, this doctor. He will notice things others miss." Thornton touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then continued alone toward the store. He arranged his features into the grim, taciturn expression the locals had come to expect from him on his infrequent visits, the look of a man who tolerated society only when absolutely necessary. The store's interior was dim after the bright spring sunshine, the air heavy with the mingled scents of coffee, tobacco leather, and the 100 other goods packed into the crowded space. A few customers browsed the shelves or lounged near the pot-bellied stove that dominated the center of the room. And there was Mercer engaged in conversation with Amos Thompson at the counter, his back to the door. The doctor's voice carried clearly in the quiet store. "Remarkable progress, really. The children adapt quickly once they understand the benefits of civilization. It's a great service we're providing." Thompson, a stocky man with a perpetually worried expression, nodded non-committally. "Heard tell some of them parents don't see it that way, Doc. Some say they don't even know where their young'uns are taken." Mercer waved a dismissive hand. "Parental resistance is to be expected in any great social advancement. They simply can't comprehend the opportunities we're offering. In time, they'll understand." The smug certainty in his voice made Thornton's jaw clench, but he forced himself to remain outwardly calm as he moved to a shelf of tobacco products, pretending to browse while listening intently. "How many you got at that school now?" Thompson asked, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. 87 at present," Mercer replied with the precision of a man who kept careful records. "Room for 100, but we're selective. Only the most promising specimens, that is, students, are admitted." The slip was subtle, but revealing. Thornton filed it away, further evidence of how Mercer viewed the native children in his care, not as students to be educated, but as specimens to be studied. "Heard you was out at Garrick's place yesterday," Thompson remarked, changing the subject, as he handed Mercer his purchase. "How's the old hermit faring?" Thornton tensed, keeping his back to the conversation, his hand unnecessarily rearranging tins of tobacco. "Better than expected," Mercer replied, a new note entering his voice, speculation tinged with suspicion. "He has company, in fact. An Apache woman, oddly enough. Quite the unexpected domestic arrangement." Thompson's eyebrows rose. "That's so. Garrick's kept to himself since burying his family. Didn't figure him for taking up with anyone, much less an Indian." "Indeed," Mercer's tone suggested volumes. "Most unexpected. I wonder if you've heard any mention of such a woman in the area. Recent escapees from reservations, perhaps. Runaways from domestic service." The pointed questions confirmed what Thornton had feared. Mercer suspected Nahimana's identity or purpose, and was already making inquiries. "Can't say as I have," Thompson replied slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was no fool, and something in Mercer's interest had clearly raised his suspicions. "Folks round here mind their business mostly. Don't much care what or who a man keeps on his property, long as there's no trouble." It was a subtle rebuke, a reminder that frontier society, for all its prejudices, maintained certain boundaries of privacy and personal choice. Thornton felt a flicker of gratitude toward the storekeeper. Mercer's lips thinned, but he maintained his cordial demeanor. "Of course, I merely asked out of medical concern. Native women often carry diseases unknown to our medical science. Public health is my primary consideration." "I'm sure it is, Doc," Thompson said, his tone neutral but his eyes hard. "Anything else you'll be needing today?" taking that as his cue. Thornton turned from the tobacco shelf and approached the counter, deliberately catching Thompson's eye. "Morning," he said gruffly, nodding to the storekeeper before acknowledging Mercer with a cooler "Doctor." If Mercer was surprised by Thornton's appearance, he concealed it well, merely adjusting his spectacles as he replied, "Garrick? What a coincidence! We were just discussing your house guest. Were you now Thornton kept his tone level, though he felt a surge of protective anger. Didn't realize my domestic arrangements were of such interest. Merely concerned for your welfare, Mercer said smoothly. As your physician. I appreciate the concern, Thornton replied, not bothering to mask the irony in his voice. But I'm managing just fine. An awkward silence fell, broken by Thompson's deliberate throat clearing. What can I get for you today, Garrick? Thornton produced a list which Thompson began to fill, moving around the store with practiced efficiency. As the storekeeper busied himself, Mercer lingered, watching Thornton with calculating eyes. I meant what I said about coming to Austin, the doctor said, his voice lowered. That bullet won't wait forever. And my clinic has facilities that could help your friend as well. Medical care is so hard to come by for her people. The threat was thinly veiled, come willingly, or I'll find other means to bring you both in. I'll consider it, Thornton said, meeting Mercer's gaze steadily. When the spring planting is done. Can't leave the farm just now. Mercer's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Don't wait too long, Garrick. Some opportunities are time-sensitive. He touched the brim of his hat. Good day to you both. I have other calls to make. As the doctor left, the bell over the door tinkling with false cheerfulness, Thornton felt a knot of tension between his shoulders release slightly. He turned to find Thompson watching him with shrewd eyes. Ain't none of my business, the storekeeper said quietly. But that man takes an unusual interest in your affairs, Garrick. I noticed, Thornton replied grimly. Thompson hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. Been hearing things about that school of his. Strange things. Children arriving but not many leaving. Parents trying to visit being turned away. Sickness that don't get reported to the county. Thornton's attention sharpened. What kind of sickness? Thompson shrugged, but his eyes were troubled. Can't rightly say. Just hear whispers. Folks down Wayward Creek way don't like to talk about it much. Afraid, maybe. Mercer's got connections in Austin, friends in high places. This confirmed what Thornton had suspected. Mercer's position and influence made him dangerous, a man who could operate outside normal constraints. Anything else you can tell me about the place? Thornton asked, keeping his tone casual even as his mind raced. Thompson studied him for a moment, clearly weighing what to say. School's about 30 miles southwest, he said finally. Old mission building added onto over the years. Tall walls around it now like a fort. Or a prison. He paused, then added significantly, road forks about 2 miles before you reach it. Right fork goes to the main gate. Left winds around to the back, where the supply wagons go in. Less watched, they say. It was clearly more than casual information. Thompson was deliberately providing details that would be useful to someone planning to enter the place unobserved. Thornton met the storekeeper's gaze, understanding passing between them. Much obliged, Thornton said quietly. Thompson nodded once, then changed the subject abruptly, raising his voice to a normal level. Got some new seed potatoes in last week. Might do well in that bottom field of yours. They continued the transaction in ordinary fashion, discussing crops and weather as Thompson gathered the supplies Thornton had requested. But when he handed over the wrapped packages, Thompson slipped a folded paper between them, his expression giving nothing away. No charge for the information, he murmured. Some things ain't for sale. Thornton tucked the paper into his pocket without examining it, understanding the need for discretion. Appreciate it, Thompson. As he left the store, supplies loaded in his saddlebags, Thornton felt the weight of what they were undertaking more keenly than before. Mercer wasn't just a cruel doctor with unusual research interests, he was a powerful man, with a network of influence and a facility that operated with minimal oversight. Whatever was happening at Wayward Creek Indian School, it was more sinister than mere cultural re-education. Rejoining Nahimana in the stand of trees, Thornton relayed what he had learned, including Mercer's thinly veiled threat and Thompson's whispered warnings. "He suspects," Nahimana said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "He will be watching for us now." "Yes," Thornton agreed grimly. "But Thompson gave me this." He withdrew the folded paper from his pocket and opened it carefully. It was a rough map drawn in Thompson's neat hand, showing the layout of Wayward Creek School and the surrounding terrain. Notes indicated guard postings, delivery schedules, and most valuable of all, the location of the girls' dormitory on the east side of the compound. "He risked much to give us this," Nahimana said softly, studying the map with intense concentration. "Thompson's a good man," Thornton replied. "Never much cared for those who abuse power." They studied the map together, committing its details to memory before Thornton carefully refolded it and secured it inside his shirt. The information was invaluable, but they would need more than a map to rescue Helena from what was clearly a well-guarded facility. "We still need to see Jenkins," Thornton said, mounting thunder once more. "He might know Mercer's vulnerabilities, things we can use against him." Nahimana nodded, her expression hardening with resolve. "Then we ride," she said simply. They set off southward, the afternoon sun warm on their backs, the road stretching before them like a promise or a threat. Behind them, the small crossroads town continued its sleepy existence, unaware that within its walls plans had been set in motion that would challenge the careful order of things. In his saddlebag, Thornton carried Thompson's map, a loaf of fresh bread, ammunition for his revolver, and a growing sense that their journey had just become infinitely more dangerous than he had anticipated. But as he glanced at Nahimana riding beside him, her profile proud against the spring sky, her hand occasionally touching the leather pouch that contained her daughter's hair, Thornton knew with unshakable certainty that they would continue regardless of the risk. Some causes were worth dying for, and for a man who had been ready to end his life just weeks ago, that realization was its own kind of redemption. The journey to Jenkins's homestead took them through rolling countryside where winter's grip was visibly loosening. Creeks ran full with snowmelt, their waters churning brown and vigorous. Green shoots pushed through the damp earth, and early wildflowers dotted sheltered slopes with splashes of color. They rode in companionable silence for the most part, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Occasionally, Nahimana would point out tracks in the soft ground, deer moving from winter shelter to spring, grazing a fox's delicate prints, alongside a stream, the distinctive mark of a turkey's passage through underbrush. Her knowledge of the natural world was deep and instinctive, a lifetime of observation encoded in her awareness. As afternoon waned toward evening, Thornton led them off the main road onto a narrower trail that wound through a stand of oak trees just beginning to leaf out. After another mile, they came upon a clearing where a well-maintained cabin stood, smoke rising from its stone chimney. Unlike Thornton's austere homestead, this place showed signs of careful attention and permanent settlement. A vegetable garden, freshly turned for spring planting, stretched beside the cabin. A small barn and corral housed several horses. Fruit trees, their branches still bare, but pruned with expert care, formed a protective windbreak on the northern edge of the clearing. Before they had fully emerged from the trees, a rifle barrel appeared at the cabin's window, steady and purposeful. "That's far enough," called a gruff voice. "State your business." Thornton reined thunder to a halt, raising one hand in a peaceful gesture while keeping the other visible on the saddle horn. "It's Thornton Garrick, Sergeant, come to pay my respects." A pause, then the rifle barrel withdrew. The cabin door opened, revealing a broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He stood with the straight-backed posture of a career soldier, though he wore simple farmer's clothes. "Garrick." Jenkins shaded his eyes against the slanting evening sun. "Well, I'll be damned. Thought you'd turned hermit up in those hills of yours." "Not far from the truth," Thornton admitted, nudging Thunder forward now that they'd been recognized. Jenkins's sharp eyes moved to Nahimana, taking in her appearance with the swift assessment of a man trained to evaluate potential threats. But there was no hostility in his gaze, merely curiosity. "Brought company, I see," he remarked, setting his rifle aside in a deliberate gesture of trust. "This is Nahimana," Thornton said as they reached the cabin and dismounted. "Nahimana, this is Sergeant—" "Just Jenkins now," the older man interrupted, extending a calloused hand to Nahimana. "Left the army and its ranks behind, same as Garrick here." Nahimana hesitated only briefly before accepting the handshake, her own smaller hand disappearing momentarily in Jenkins's substantial grip. "Any friend of Garrick's is welcome at my fire," Jenkins said, his weathered face creasing in a smile that transformed his stern features. "Though I'm surprised to see him with any friend at all, given his tendency toward isolation." There was gentle chiding in the words, the kind possible only between men who had shared hardships. Thornton accepted it with a nod, recognizing the truth in the observation. "Come inside." Jenkins continued gesturing toward the cabin. "Sun's getting low and nights still have a bite to them. You look like you've been riding hard." Inside the cabin was warm and surprisingly comfortable, with sturdy furniture walls lined with bookshelves and a few simple but fine carpets on the plank floor. A woman worked at the hearth, stirring something in a large pot that filled the room with a savory aroma. She turned at their entrance, revealing a handsome face, with strong native features framed by gray-streaked black hair. "Marion, we have guests," Jenkins said, his voice softening as he addressed her. "Thornton Garrick, who served with me in the 4th Virginia, and his friend Nahimana." Marion nodded in greeting, her dark eyes assessing, but not unwelcoming. "Dinner is nearly ready," she said, her English clear but accented. "There is plenty." Thornton was momentarily taken aback, though he tried to hide it. Jenkins must have noticed, for he chuckled softly. "Surprised Garrick Marion is my wife these 10 years now. Met her after I left the service when I was doing supply runs for the reservation up north." His expression grew more serious. "Saw enough during the war, and after, to know that the color of a person's skin means a damn sight less than the quality of their character." Nahimana, who had been standing slightly behind Thornton, stepped forward, addressing Marion in a language Thornton didn't recognize. Marion's eyes widened slightly, and she responded in the same tongue, the words flowing between them in what was clearly a significant exchange. When they finished, Marion turned to Jenkins. "She is Lipan Apache," she explained. "As was my mother. We share some words, some stories." Jenkins nodded unsurprised. "Small world," he remarked, then gestured for his guests to sit at the sturdy table. "Now, I doubt this is a social call, given your reputation for avoiding society, Garrick. What brings you to my door after all these years?" Thornton glanced at Nahimana, receiving a small nod of permission before he spoke. "We need information, Jenkins, about Dr. Calvin Mercer and his school at Wayward Creek." The atmosphere in the cabin changed instantly, a tension entering the air like the charge before a lightning strike. Marion's hands stilled on the ladle she was holding, and Jenkins's expression hardened, the smile vanishing from his weathered face. "Mercer," he said flatly. "Now, there's a name I hadn't hoped to hear again." "You know him," Thornton said, not a question but a confirmation. Jenkins's eyes grew distant, focusing on memories rather than the present. "Know him? Yes, you could say that. He was attached to our unit for a time during the pacification campaigns, Army surgeons supposedly there to tend our wounded. He paused, his mouth twisting in distaste. But he had other interests that went beyond medicine. What kind of interests? Thornton prompted, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Jenkins exchanged a look with Marion, some unspoken communication passing between them. She nodded slightly, and he continued. He was obsessed with studying the natives we encountered, not as people but as specimens. Requested permission to examine captives' conduct tests. Jenkins's voice grew harder. When officers denied his more extreme requests, he'd find ways around the restrictions. Prisoners would disappear from holding areas, turn up days later with unexplained injuries, signs of experimentation. Marion had returned to her cooking, but her back was rigid, her movements sharp with suppressed emotion. I reported him, Jenkins continued, his hands clenching on the table. Wrote detailed accounts of what I'd witnessed, sent them up the chain of command. But Mercer had friends in high places, a wealthy family and Boston connections in Washington. My reports disappeared, and I found myself facing discharge for conduct unbecoming. It was made clear that further accusations would result in more severe consequences. "So you left," Thornton said, understanding now why Jenkins had abandoned a promising military career. "Couldn't stomach it anymore," Jenkins confirmed. "The war was one thing terrible, but at least we faced armed men who could fight back. What came after?" He shook his head. "It wasn't soldiering. It was something else, something I wanted no part of." Marion brought bowls of stew to the table, her movements graceful, despite the emotion Thornton could sense beneath her composed exterior. As she served, she spoke quietly. "The school at Wayward Creek opened 3 years ago," she said. "Children taken from villages, from reservations. Parents told they would be educated civilized. But stories come back children who die from strange illnesses, who return changed in ways that go beyond haircuts and white men's clothes." Nahimana leaned forward, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "My daughter is there," she said simply. "Halona. Taken when our village was destroyed." Jenkins and Marion exchanged another look, this one heavy with shared knowledge. "How old is she?" Marion asked gently. 8 summers now," Nahimana replied. "She was 5 when they took her." "Small for her age?" Jenkins asked. With a birthmark on her right shoulder, shaped somewhat like a crescent moon, Nahimana's intake of breath was sharp, her hand flying to the leather pouch at her neck. "Yes," she whispered. "How do you know this?" Jenkins's expression was grave. "Because Marion's niece is a kitchen worker at the school. She smuggles out messages when she can, tells us which children have arrived, which have left. She mentioned a small Apache girl with such a mark brought in about 2 years ago. The child rarely speaks, but has shown unusual resistance to their efforts to civilize her." Hope and fear warred on Nahimana's face. "She lives?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "As of 2 weeks ago, yes," Jenkins confirmed. But Marion's niece warned that Mercer has taken a special interest in her. He believes she has what he calls exceptional mental capacities, some kind of intelligence or ability that has drawn his scientific attention. Thornton felt cold despite the warm room. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Marion said, her voice hardening, "that he subjects her to tests, special lessons, time alone in his study where other students are not permitted." The implication hung heavy in the air. Nahimana's face had gone very still, a mask of control over what Thornton knew must be overwhelming emotion. "We're going to get her out," Thornton said, looking directly at Jenkins. "We have some information already, a map of the facility delivery schedules. But we need more. Weaknesses in their security routines we can exploit. Anything you or your niece might know that could help." Jenkins studied Thornton with shrewd eyes. "This isn't your fight, Garrick. Why risk your life for it?" The question was fair, and Thornton took a moment to consider his answer. "Maybe it's time I found a fight worth the risk," he said finally. "I've spent 3 years waiting to die, Jenkins. Maybe it's time I remembered how to live instead." A slow smile spread across Jenkins's weathered face. "Well now," he said, "that sounds like the Lieutenant Garrick I knew back in '63, the one who led that night raid to free our captured men at Fredericksburg." "I'm not that man anymore," Thornton said quietly. "Maybe more than you think," Jenkins replied. He turned to Nahimana. "Your daughter is fortunate to have a mother willing to brave such danger for her." "Any mother would do the same," Nahimana said simply. "Perhaps," Jenkins acknowledged, "but few would have the courage and skill to attempt it." He turned back to Thornton. "I'll help you, both of you, not just with information, but in person. Marion's niece has been planning to leave the school's employment anyway, too dangerous to stay much longer. The 3 of us together stand a better chance than you 2 alone." Thornton hadn't expected this level of commitment, and he hesitated. "It's a significant risk, Jenkins. Mercer has influence connections." "All the more reason to have more hands in this fight," Jenkins countered. "And I've been itching to balance accounts with Calvin Mercer for a very long time." Marion laid a hand on her husband's shoulder. "We have discussed this before," she said. "Many times. The children at that place deserve freedom. Helona is not the only one suffering." The simple statement reminded Thornton of the larger context beyond their personal mission. Dozens of native children held in what was essentially a prison disguised as a school subjected to unknown experiments by a man whose scientific curiosity knew no ethical bounds. We welcome your help," Nahimana said. Before Thornton could respond, her dark eyes meeting Jenkins with quiet dignity. "For my daughter, and for all the children." Jenkins nodded, a soldier's decisiveness returning to his bearing. "Then we plan tonight, and move tomorrow. Mercer makes a weekly trip to Austin every Thursday tomorrow to report to his financial backers and collect supplies. The security is lighter in his absence." "Marion's niece?" Thornton asked. "Can she help from inside?" "Elena will create a distraction if needed," Marion confirmed. "She has prepared for this possibility. She can also identify Helona with certainty and guide you to where she is kept." As the conversation turned to specific plans, maps spread across the table, and contingencies discussed in low, serious voices, Thornton felt a curious lightening of his spirit, despite the danger ahead. For the first time in years, he was part of something larger than his own grief, working alongside others toward a purpose that mattered. Across the table, Nahimana's eyes met his briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had begun this journey as unlikely allies brought together by circumstance, but something deeper had formed in the shared purpose and growing trust between them. Outside night had fallen completely, stars appearing in the clear spring sky. Within the cabin's warm circle of lamplight, 4 people bent their heads together over maps and diagrams, united in a cause that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. Tomorrow would bring risk, perhaps death. But tonight, there was planning to be done, a mission to prepare for, and a child to save. For Thornton Garrick, who had once sought death as a release from pain, it was a revelation to discover how fiercely he now wished to live, to see this through, to help Nahimana reclaim her daughter, to right at least one small portion of the wrongs he had witnessed, and through inaction enabled. The bullet near his heart was still there, a constant reminder of mortality. But, for the first time since Sarah and Matthew had been laid to rest on that lonely hill, Thornton found himself praying not for an end to his journey, but for enough time to complete the task before him. Enough time to bring Helona home to her mother. Enough time, perhaps, to find redemption in the eyes of a woman who had every reason to hate him, yet had somehow shown him the way back to life instead. Dawn broke clear and cold, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Thornton stood on Jenkins's porch, watching the new day emerge, his mind already racing with the plans they had finalized late into the previous night. Behind him, the cabin hummed with quiet activity, Jenkins checking weapons, Marion preparing food for the journey, Nahimana in deep conversation with both gleaning final details about what to expect at Wayward Creek. The map they had studied showed a formidable facility, the converted mission building at its center, surrounded by newer constructions, dormitories, classrooms, work areas, all enclosed within a high wall, ostensibly meant to keep the wilderness out, but clearly designed to keep the students in. Mercer's weekly absence offered their best chance of success. According to Marion's niece Elena, the doctor departed for Austin every Thursday morning and didn't return until late Friday, leaving the school under the supervision of a headmaster more interested in discipline than security. Their plan was as simple as circumstances allowed. Jenkins would create a diversion at the main gate, drawing attention and resources away from the rear of the facility. Meanwhile, Thornton and Nahimana would enter through the service entrance during the regular afternoon delivery of supplies, locate Helona with Elena's help, and escape before the alarm could be raised. Simple in theory, infinitely more complex in execution. The sound of footsteps brought Thornton back to the present. Nahimana joined him on the porch, her expression composed, but her eyes bright with a mix of hope and fear. "Jenkins says we should leave within the hour," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion Thornton knew she must be feeling. "Mercer has already departed for Austin. The supply wagon will reach Wayward Creek by mid-afternoon." Thornton nodded, studying her face in the clear morning light. She looked different today, stronger, more determined than ever, a warrior preparing for battle rather than a woman fleeing persecution. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. Nahimana considered the question seriously, her gaze turning to the brightening horizon. "Yes," she admitted, "but not of what might happen to me. I fear for Helona what they have done to her, whether she will remember me, whether she can heal from what she has endured." It was a mother's fear, profound and selfless. Thornton felt humbled by it. "Children are resilient," he offered, "more than we give them credit for." "Yes," Nahimana agreed. "But some wounds do not show on the skin. Those are hardest to heal." Thornton thought of his own invisible wounds, grief for Sarah and Matthew, guilt over the atrocities he had witnessed, and failed to prevent the slow death of spirit he had experienced until Nahimana's arrival. She had seen those wounds, had recognized them without judgment, had somehow begun the process of healing them through her own example of courage and purpose. "You'll help her heal," he said with certainty, "as you've helped me." Nahimana looked at him, then surprise flickering across her face, followed by a softer expression he had rarely seen her wear. "We have helped each other, I think," she said quietly. The moment stretched between them, fragile and significant. Thornton found himself wanting to say more to express the profound change she had catalyzed in him. But before he could find the words, Jenkins appeared in the doorway behind them. "Time to move." He announced, his voice that of a sergeant, preparing his troops for engagement. "We've got a long ride ahead and a narrow window of opportunity." The spell-broken Thornton and Nahimana turned from the sunrise to the practical matters at hand. Within minutes, they were mounted and ready. Thornton on Thunder, Nahimana on Sally Jenkins on his sturdy chestnut gelding. Marion stood in the doorway, a stillness about her that spoke of many such partings over the years. "Be careful," she said simply. "All of you." Jenkins leaned down from his saddle to clasp her hand briefly. "We'll bring Elena home," he promised. "And the child." With a final nod to his wife, Jenkins led the way down the trail, Thornton and Nahimana following close behind. They rode in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts, the gravity of what lay ahead weighing on them all. The journey to Wayward Creek took them through increasingly rugged country-wooded hills, giving way to rocky outcroppings and narrow valleys where streams cut their way through limestone formations. It was beautiful in its wild way, the kind of terrain Thornton had always appreciated for its solitude and unspoiled character. By early afternoon, they crested a rise that offered their first view of their destination. In a valley below the Wayward Creek Indian School stood like an island of rigid order, in the natural landscape a complex of stone and wooden buildings surrounded by a high wall, a thin wisp of smoke rising from what must be the kitchen chimney. From this distance, it might have appeared benign, even picturesque, but Thornton felt a chill as he observed the regular patrols along the wall, the barred windows visible even from their vantage point, the complete absence of children playing or moving freely about the grounds. "More like a prison than a school," Jenkins murmured, echoing Thornton's thoughts. Nahimana said nothing, but her hand moved to the leather pouch at her neck, drawing strength from the tangible connection to her daughter. They retreated from the ridge before they could be spotted, making their way to a small grove of trees where they had agreed to separate. Here, Jenkins would branch off toward the main gate while Thornton and Nahimana continued to the delivery entrance at the rear of the facility. "Remember," Jenkins said as they prepared to part ways, "the diversion begins at precisely 3 o'clock. Elena will be watching for you at the kitchen door. You'll have perhaps 10 minutes before they realize something's wrong." Thornton checked his pocket watch, synchronizing it with Jenkins's. 3 o'clock, he confirmed. "We'll be ready." Jenkins turned to Nahimana, his expression solemn. "Your daughter may be frightened, confused. She's been there nearly 3 years, may not remember life before." "She will remember," Nahimana said with quiet certainty. "A child does not forget her mother's face, her voice." Jenkins nodded, respecting her conviction. "Good luck to you both," he said, offering his hand first to Thornton, then to Nahimana. "See you at the rendezvous point by nightfall." With that, he turned his horse toward the eastern approach to the school, where he would enact his part of the plan, a convincing portrayal of a government inspector arriving unexpectedly to evaluate the facility's operations. Left alone, Thornton and Nahimana continued toward the western side of the valley, where the supply road wound through a stand of trees before approaching the service entrance to the school. According to their information, a wagon from town made deliveries every Thursday afternoon, bringing food materials and mail. They tethered their horses in a concealed spot off the road, then proceeded on foot to a position where they could observe without being seen. Within the hour, the expected wagon appeared, driven by a middle-aged man, accompanied by a younger assistant, both looking bored with their routine task. Thornton and Nahimana watched as the wagon approached the rear gate, was briefly inspected by a guard, then admitted to the compound. The gate remained open as the wagon was unloaded, providing the opportunity they had been counting on. "Almost time," Thornton murmured, checking his watch again, 2:45. In 15 minutes, Jenkins would arrive at the main gate, creating the distraction they needed. Beside him, Nahimana was utterly still, her breathing calm and measured, despite what must be a storm of emotions beneath her composed exterior. She had changed into simpler, darker clothing that would attract less attention inside the facility, her long hair bound tightly at the nape of her neck. "When we find her," Thornton said quietly, "let me approach first. She might be frightened of a stranger, but less likely to cry out if it's a white man given where she's been living. Nahimana nodded, acknowledging the practical wisdom of his suggestion, though he could see the pain it caused her to think that her own child might fear her appearance. At precisely 3 o'clock, a commotion became audible from the direction of the main gate. Raised voices, the sound of horses, Jenkins's authoritative tones carrying clearly in the afternoon air. Almost immediately, the guard at the service entrance turned his attention that way, stepping away from his post to get a better view of what was happening. "Now," Thornton whispered. They moved swiftly from their hiding place, using the wagon as cover as they slipped through the open gate into the compound. The delivery men were too busy unloading crates to notice 2 additional figures in the shadows of the wall, and the guard remained distracted by the more interesting events at the main entrance. Once inside, they pressed themselves against the inner wall, taking a moment to orient themselves according to the memorized map. The kitchen should be directly ahead, and somewhere within, Elena would be waiting to guide them to Helona. They moved quickly but cautiously across the open yard to the kitchen door, Thornton leading the way, while Nahimana followed close behind her, movements silent and precise. At the door, Thornton knocked softly in the pattern they had arranged, 2 quick raps, a pause, then 3 more. The door opened immediately, revealing a young native woman with anxious eyes. "Quickly," she whispered, ushering them inside. "Uncle Jenkins's distraction is working, but it won't last long." The kitchen was blessedly empty, the other workers apparently drawn to the windows at the front of the building by the commotion Jenkins was creating. Elena led them through the warm, aromatic space to a narrow service corridor beyond. "The girls' dormitory is through here, and to the right," she explained in hushed tones. "But Helona isn't there. Mercer keeps her separate from the others in a room adjoining his office." Nahimana's sharp intake of breath was the only indication of her distress at this information. Thornton felt his own anger rising at the implication of the arrangement. "Where?" he asked tersely. "Second floor, east wing," Elena replied. "The office has 2 rooms, an outer study, where he receives visitors, and an inner room where he conducts his research. That's where she stays." "Is it guarded?" Thornton asked. Elena shook her head. "Not when he's away. No one is permitted to enter except Mercer himself and Headmaster Collins, who brings her meals." She hesitated, then added, "But Collins is currently occupied with your uncle at the main gate. He'll be there for some time." "Then let's move," Thornton said, glancing at Nahimana, who nodded once her face set with determination. They followed Elena through a maze of corridors, encountering no one. The school seemed eerily quiet, the expected sounds of children notably absent. "Where is everyone?" Thornton whispered as they climbed a narrow staircase. "The students are in afternoon classes on the west side," Elena explained. "Most of the staff are either supervising them or have gone to investigate the disturbance." They reached the second floor and moved down a well-appointed hallway that contrasted sharply with the austere corridors they had traversed earlier. Here, polished wooden floors gleamed in the afternoon light, filtering through tall windows. Framed diplomas and scientific illustrations hung on walls paneled in dark wood. It was clearly the administrative area of the school, where Mercer established his credentials and impressed visitors with the veneer of academic respectability. Elena stopped before a heavy oak door with a brass nameplate reading, "Dr. Calvin Mercer, Director." She produced a key from her pocket with shaking hands. "I took this from Collins's office," she whispered. "He keeps copies of all keys. When he discovers it's missing—" She didn't finish the thought. "You've been very brave," Nahimana said softly, the first words she had spoken since entering the facility. Elena's eyes met hers briefly, a flash of shared understanding passing between the 2 native women. "Some risks are worth taking," she said simply. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and they entered Mercer's outer office, a spacious room dominated by a large desk and bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Medical instruments and specimens in glass jars lined one wall, their contents better left unexamined. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and something sharper, more chemical. At the far side stood another door, smaller and less imposing, but secured with a more substantial lock. Elena tried several keys from her ring before finding one that fit. "This is as far as I've ever been," she admitted as the lock clicked open. "I don't know what's beyond." Nahimana stepped forward, her hand on the doorknob. "I go first," she said, her voice allowing no argument. Thornton wanted to protest, to shield her from whatever lay beyond, to be the first to face any danger, but he recognized her right to lead this moment. With a nod, he stepped back, allowing her to open the door. The room beyond was small and dimly lit, the only window covered with heavy drapes that admitted just a thin line of sunlight at the edges. As their eyes adjusted to the gloom, the contents of the room gradually became visible: a narrow bed, a small table with papers, and what appeared to be testing equipment and shelves lined with more specimens, books, and instruments. And there, curled on the bed, with her back to the door, was a small figure, motionless, except for the gentle rise and fall of breathing. "Halona," Nahimana whispered the name, a prayer on her lips. The child didn't stir, either asleep or pretending to be. Nahimana moved forward slowly, her footsteps deliberately audible to avoid startling the girl. At the edge of the bed she knelt, bringing herself to eye level with her daughter. "Halona," she said again, a little louder. "Chiaji, my child." The girl tensed, but didn't turn, her small body curling tighter into itself. "It's Mother Halona," Nahimana continued in her native tongue, the musical words filling the sterile room with warmth. "I've come to take you home." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the child began to turn. Thornton held his breath, witnessing a moment so private and profound that he felt like an intruder, despite his role in making it possible. As Halona fully faced her mother for the first time in 3 years, Thornton saw a small face that bore a striking resemblance to Nahimana. The same high cheekbones, the same full lips, the same dark, intelligent eyes. But where Nahimana's expression was usually composed and measured, her daughter's face reflected a wariness beyond her years, a guardedness that no 8-year-old should possess. For a long moment, mother and daughter simply looked at each other, separated by 3 years of absence and experiences that could never be fully shared or understood. Then, Nahimana did something unexpected. From around her neck she removed the leather pouch that she had carried and touched so often. Opening it carefully, she withdrew the lock of black hair, holding it where Halona could see. "I kept this close to my heart," she said softly in their language. "Every day since they took you, to remind me that I would find you again." The child's eyes fixed on the lock of hair, recognition dawning in her gaze. One small hand moved to her own hair, cut short in the school's enforced style, but still the same rich black as the strands her mother held. "You cut it for me," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse, "before the soldiers came." "Yes," Nahimana confirmed, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "To protect you, to keep a part of you with me always." With those words, something broke in Halona's careful reserve. With a small cry, she launched herself into her mother's arms, burying her face against Nahimana's shoulder as sobs shook her tiny frame. Nahimana held her daughter tightly, rocking slightly, murmuring words of comfort and love in their shared language. The reunion was everything it should be, raw emotional healing, but Thornton was acutely aware of the passing minutes, the risk increasing with each one. Elena clearly shared his concern. "We need to go," she whispered urgently. "Now, while the confusion at the main gate still has everyone's attention." Thornton nodded, then approached the embracing pair kneeling beside them. "Nahimana," he said gently, "we have to move." She looked up momentarily disoriented, as if she had forgotten where they were in the joy of finding her daughter. Then reality reasserted itself and she nodded, composing her features. "Halona," she said in English, pulling back slightly to look at her daughter's face. "This is Thornton. He helped me find you. We must go with him now quickly and quietly. Can you do that?" Halona regarded Thornton with wary eyes, the instinctive distrust of a child who had learned that white men brought pain and separation. But she nodded, her small hand clutching her mother's with fierce determination. "Good girl," Thornton said softly, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Let's get you home." They moved swiftly back through Mercer's office, Elena locking the doors behind them to delay discovery of the empty room as long as possible. The hallway remained deserted, but as they reached the staircase, the sounds of activity below indicated that the diversion at the main gate might be concluding. "This way," Elena whispered, leading them down a service stairwell rather than the main stairs. "The kitchen will be busy now, preparing dinner. We'll go through the laundry instead." They descended to the ground floor and followed Elena through a series of utility corridors smelling of soap and damp cloth. The laundry room was large and steamy, with several women working at huge tubs and mangles. None looked up as they passed through, whether from indifference or deliberate blindness, to what was clearly an escape in progress. At the rear of the laundry, a small door led directly to the yard near the service gate. Elena paused, peering carefully outside, before motioning them forward. "The wagon is just leaving," she reported. "The gate will close behind it. We need to move now or wait for another opportunity." "Now," Thornton decided, knowing that each passing minute increased the chance of Halona's absence being discovered. They slipped outside, keeping close to the wall, Nahimana carrying Halona, who was remarkably silent and cooperative despite the tension surrounding them. The delivery wagon was, indeed, passing through the gate, the guard holding it open with an expression of bored routine. "When the wagon clears the gate, we run," Thornton murmured. "Straight for those trees to the west. Our horses are there." Nahimana nodded, shifting Halona to a more secure position in her arms. The child was small for her age, almost unnaturally so, making Thornton wonder about the conditions she had endured in Mercer's care. The wagon cleared the gate. The guard began to swing it closed. "Now," Thornton said, and they broke cover, racing for the narrowing opening. They were halfway there when a shout rang out from the main building, a cry of alarm that told Thornton their escape had been discovered. The guard at the gate turned his hand, going to the pistol at his hip, as he spotted the fleeing group. "Stop!" he called, drawing his weapon. "Stop, or I'll shoot!" Thornton made a split-second decision. Pushing Nahimana and Halona ahead of him, he turned to face the guard, his own revolver appearing in his hand with the swift precision of a former soldier. "Lower your weapon," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of an officer accustomed to being obeyed. The guard hesitated, clearly unprepared for armed resistance. In that moment of indecision, Elena darted forward and slammed the gate shut from the outside, its heavy latch falling into place with a definitive clang. "Run!" Thornton shouted, backing away from the gate where the guard now stood, trapped, shouting for assistance. They fled toward the trees, the sounds of pursuit growing behind them as more guards responded to the alarm. Halona clung to her mother, face buried against her neck, while Elena kept pace beside them, her knowledge of the terrain guiding them to the least visible path. Reaching the spot where they had left the horses, they found Thunder and Sally still tethered and waiting, but a third horse had joined them, a sturdy pinto that Elena greeted with evident relief. "Uncle Jenkins left her for me," she explained quickly, untying the mare. "He must have made it out safely." There was no time for discussion. Thornton helped Nahimana mount Sally, then handed Helona up to her, the child sitting securely in front of her mother. Elena was already astride her pinto, and Thornton swung onto Thunder's back, wincing as the exertion triggered a twinge from the bullet near his heart. "This way," Elena called, guiding her horse deeper into the trees, away from the road and the pursuing guards. They rode hard, following game trails and creek beds that offered concealment and confused their trail. Behind them, the shouts of pursuit gradually faded, though Thornton knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Once Mercer learned of Helona's escape, he would bring every resource at his disposal to bear on recapturing her. As the sun began to set, they reached the rendezvous point Jenkins had designated a small cave set into a limestone bluff, invisible from the main trail, but offering a clear view of approaches. Jenkins himself was already there, a small fire burning just inside the cave entrance, his expression relaxing visibly when he saw them arrive. "You made it," he said, helping Elena dismount and embracing her briefly. His eyes moved to Helona, still clinging tightly to Nahimana. "And you found the child. Well done, both of you." "It was close," Thornton admitted, dismounting carefully to avoid triggering another pain in his chest. "They discovered us just as we were leaving. They'll be searching in force by now." Jenkins nodded grimly. "We'll rest here tonight, then make for the border before dawn. I've sent word to some friends among the Comanche. They'll help us reach the territory where Mercer's influence doesn't reach." The plan was sound, but Thornton knew the risks remained high. Mercer would not easily surrender what he considered his property, both Helona and her mother. Inside the cave, Elena had prepared a simple meal, which they ate in relative silence, the gravity of what they had done and what still lay ahead weighing on them all. Helona remained pressed against her mother's side, accepting small bites of food when offered, but otherwise withdrawn, her dark eyes watchful and wary. After they had eaten, Jenkins and Elena moved deeper into the cave to prepare sleeping arrangements, giving Nahimana a few moments alone with her daughter. Thornton stood at the cave entrance, ostensibly keeping watch, but also providing privacy for the reunited pair. The night air was cool, but not cold, the spring stars brilliant overhead. Thornton found his thoughts turning to Sarah and Matthew, wondering what they would think of what he had done today, of the man he was becoming after 3 years of merely existing. "You did a good thing today, Garrick," Jenkins said quietly, joining him at the entrance. "A brave thing." "We all did," Thornton replied. "And it's not over yet. Mercer won't give up easily." "No," Jenkins agreed. "But neither will we." He paused, then added, "That woman and her child, they've awakened something in you. Something I thought was buried with your family." Thornton didn't immediately respond, the observation cutting too close to truths he was still coming to terms with himself. Finally, he said simply, "They showed me there's more than one way to honor the dead." Jenkins nodded understanding without need for further explanation. "Get some rest," he advised. "I'll take first watch. Long day ahead tomorrow." As Thornton moved back into the cave, he passed Nahimana and Helona, now curled together on a bed of blankets, the child finally asleep in her mother's protective embrace. Nahimana looked up as he passed, their eyes meeting in the dim light. "Thank you," she whispered, the simple words laden with meaning beyond expression. Thornton nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotions swirling within him: pride in what they had accomplished, fear for what lay ahead, and something deeper, more personal, that had been growing since that snowy night when Nahimana had first appeared at his door. "Rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow we get you both to safety." As he settled onto his own blanket, Thornton felt the familiar pain in his chest, the bullet shifting slightly as it had thousands of times before. But tonight, instead of welcoming the reminder of mortality, he found himself hoping for more time. Time to see Nahimana and Halona safely beyond Mercer's reach. Time to discover what might be possible in a life no longer defined by grief and guilt. Time, perhaps, to truly live again. Outside, the night deepened, stars wheeling slowly overhead. Inside the cave, 6 people bound by circumstance and choice rested in uneasy peace, each carrying their own hopes and fears for what the coming day might bring. For Thornton Garrick, the future had suddenly become something to fight for rather than something to endure. It was a profound shift, as significant as it was unexpected. And it had all begun with a knock on his door during a blizzard when a woman with determined eyes had asked for shelter from the cold. Dawn painted the limestone bluffs in soft gold, while shadows still clung to the valleys below. Jenkins stood watch outside the cave, his weathered face grim as he scanned the terrain for signs of pursuit. Inside, preparation for departure was already underway. Elena packed their meager supplies, while Nahimana helped Halona dress in warmer clothing. The child remained silent, her movements precise, and wary dark eyes constantly seeking her mother, as if fearing she might vanish again. Thornton checked his revolver, the familiar weight a reminder of what likely lay ahead. His sleep had been restless, filled with dreams of Sarah and Matthew watching him from their hillside graves, not with accusation as in the past, but with something that felt remarkably like approval. "Riders coming from the south," Jenkins announced from the entrance. 6, maybe 7, moving in formation along the main trail. Thornton joined him, spotting the approaching party through the morning mist, not random searchers, but a coordinated unit moving with military precision. "Mercer must have returned early from Austin," he said grimly. "Those aren't just school guards." "No," Jenkins agreed. "Those are professionals." He lowered his voice to ensure Halona wouldn't hear. "They'll have the territory covered within hours." Nahimana approached, her face composed, but her eyes betraying concern. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Thornton assessed their options, none promising. North would take them directly into the rider's path. South or east led toward settlements where Mercer's connections with authorities would make capture likely. West, he decided, into the Llano, rough country but fewer people, more places to hide. "The Llano Estacado is no easy crossing," Jenkins cautioned, "especially with a child. Little water, less shelter." "It could work," Elena offered. "My mother's people crossed the Llano many times. I know where to find water, how to travel unseen." Jenkins studied the approaching riders once more before nodding decisively. "West it is. We'll need to move fast." They broke camp, swiftly erasing all signs of their presence. Halona watched with solemn eyes, her small hand never leaving her mother's when possible. Before mounting, Thornton knelt before the child. "Halona," he said gently, "we have a long ride ahead. It might be scary sometimes, but we're going to keep you safe. Do you understand?" The girl regarded him with unnervingly adult eyes. Then, surprising them all, she spoke in careful English. "The doctor will be angry that I am gone. He will try to find me." Her simple statement, delivered with such understanding, made Thornton's heart ache. "Yes," he acknowledged, seeing no point in lying. "But he won't find you. We won't let that happen." Halona studied his face, then nodded once. Her small hand reached out, touching the worn leather of his gun belt. "You will stop him if he comes." The question hung heavy with implications. Thornton glanced at Nahimana, whose face reflected the painful reality they faced this child understood the stakes all too well. "If I have to," Thornton promised simply. They mounted Helona, riding with Nahimana Elena on her Pinto Jenkins and Thornton on their respective horses, and set out westward, skirting the ridge to remain hidden from the riders below their path, taking them toward the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Llano Estacado. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and their pursuers. The landscape changed gradually as they traveled, becoming more sparse, the trees giving way to scrub and rolling plains that stretched toward the distant horizon. They stopped briefly in the shelter of a rocky outcropping, resting the horses and sharing a cold meal. Helona ate little, but drank thirstily, the journey clearly taking a toll on her small body. "How much farther to safe territory?" Thornton asked Jenkins as they studied the horizon. "2 days hard riding to reach the western settlements where Mercer has less influence," the older man replied. "Maybe 3 with the child." Nahimana sat nearby, braiding Helona's short hair with gentle fingers. The intimate gesture seemed to soothe the girl, who leaned into her mother's touch with closed eyes. "She's been through so much," Elena observed quietly. 3 years in that place. Thornton nodded, watching the pair. "What exactly was Mercer doing with her? You mentioned tests." Elena's expression darkened. "Mercer believes some native children have special abilities, what he calls heightened sensory perception, or natural intuition. He selects those who show signs of unusual intelligence or awareness for his studies." "What kind of studies?" Jenkins asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Tests of endurance, memory, perception under different conditions." Elena hesitated. "Sometimes painful conditions. He believes pain sharpens certain abilities." Thornton felt a cold fury building within him. "He tortured children in the name of science." "He called it research," Elena said simply. "Important work for the advancement of knowledge." Nahimana had finished braiding Helona's hair, and now held her close, whispering something in their native language that made the child nod solemnly. "She's telling her that she's safe now," Elena translated softly. "That no one will hurt her again." Thornton wished he could be certain that promise could be kept. With Mercer in pursuit, backed by hired guns and the authority of his position, their small group faced daunting odds. As if reading his thoughts, Jenkins spoke up. "We should move on. Those riders will have picked up our trail by now." They mounted again, continuing westward, as the afternoon sun beat down with increasing intensity. The land grew more barren, the gentle hills flattening into the beginnings of the vast tableland known as the Llano Estacado, the staked plain, so featureless that Spanish explorers had driven stakes into the ground to mark their path. Elena led them, now her knowledge of this harsh terrain proving invaluable as she guided them toward hidden springs and the scanty shade offered by occasional ravines. As they rode, Thornton found himself drawing closer to Nahimana and Helona. Protective instincts he had thought long dead awakening within him. The child seemed to sense his concern, occasionally glancing back at him with those solemn eyes that held too much knowledge for one so young. By evening, they reached a small canyon cut into the otherwise flat plain, a place where a seasonal stream had carved a refuge of sorts. Here, sheltered by the canyon walls, they made camp for the night, risking a small fire as darkness fell. After a simple meal, Helona fell asleep in her mother's arms, exhaustion finally overcoming the vigilance that had kept her alert throughout the day. Nahimana gently laid her on a blanket near the fire, then joined the adults gathered on the opposite side to discuss their situation. "How far behind do you think they are?" Nahimana asked, her voice low to avoid waking Helona. Jenkins considered. "Half a day, maybe less. They're moving faster than us with fresher horses and no child to consider." "They'll catch up," Thornton stated flatly. It's just a matter of when. Then we need a plan for when they do, Elena said. A place where we can defend ourselves if necessary. They spoke quietly, weighing options, studying the rough map Jenkins had sketched in the dirt. Thornton was so focused on the discussion that he almost missed the small sound from where Helona slept, a whimper barely audible above the crackling fire. Nahimana heard it too, rising quickly to go to her daughter. The child was still asleep, but clearly distressed, her small body tense, her face contorted in what could only be a nightmare. Helona, Nahimana called softly, stroking her daughter's cheek. Wake up, little one. It's just a dream. The girl's eyes flew open, wild with fear, until they focused on her mother's face. Then, with a small cry, she threw her arms around Nahimana's neck, trembling violently. He was coming, she whispered loud enough for Thornton to hear. The doctor, he was in my head again. Nahimana held her daughter tightly, murmuring reassurances, but over Helona's shoulder her eyes met Thornton's with unmistakable concern. When Helona had calmed and drifted back to sleep, Nahimana rejoined the group, her face troubled. What did she mean, in her head? Thornton asked gently. Nahimana's hand went to the leather pouch at her neck, a gesture Thornton had seen many times. Before the soldiers came, she began slowly, our people recognized that Helona was different, more aware. She knew things sometimes when storms were coming, when hunters would return, which plants would heal specific ailments. The elders called her twice blessed, one who sees with both eyes and spirit. And Mercer discovered this ability. Jenkins guessed, his expression grim. Nahimana nodded. He called it by different names, but he recognized it. That is why he kept her separate, why he conducted his tests. He was trying to understand how she knows things, to strengthen that knowing through... She trailed off, unable to continue. Through pain, Elena finished quietly. He believes suffering enhances these abilities. A heavy silence fell over the group. Thornton felt the familiar anger rising within him. Anger at what had been done to this child, at the system that allowed it, at his own past complicity in that system. We need to get her far away from him, he said finally. Somewhere he can never reach her again. There's more, Nahimana said hesitantly. Something I haven't told you. She took a deep breath, her hand still on the leather pouch. Mercer is Helona's father. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Thornton stared at Nahimana, trying to comprehend what she was saying. When he bought me from the soldiers, she continued, her voice steady, despite the pain behind her words, he used me for his experiments, and for other purposes. When he discovered I was with child, he was pleased. Said it would provide an opportunity to study the development of mixed blood from conception. My God! Jenkins breathed, the horror of it evident in his weathered face. When Helona was born, he allowed me to care for her until she was old enough for his studies to begin. Then we were separated. I escaped, but couldn't find her until now. Nahimana's composure slipped for just a moment before she regained control. This is why he hunts us so intensely. Helona is not just a subject to him. She is his creation, his property in the most complete sense. That explains his obsession, Elena said quietly. She's not just research to him, she's proof of his theories. Thornton felt physically ill at what Nahimana had endured, at the monstrous reality of Mercer's work. It cast everything in a new light, the doctor's possessive interest, his determination to recapture them, the resources he was willing to expend in the pursuit. It changes nothing about our course, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, except to make it even more important. that he never gets his hands on either of you again." Nahimana looked at him with gratitude in her dark eyes. "I should have told you sooner. I was afraid that it would matter to us, that we'd think differently of you or Helona." Jenkins interrupted gently. "Child, we've all seen enough of this world's cruelty to know where the blame lies. And it isn't with you or that innocent girl." Thornton nodded agreement, unable to find words adequate to express his feelings. Instead, he reached across the space between them and took Nahimana's hand, a silent promise that nothing she had revealed changed his commitment to their safety. As the fire burned low and the others settled to sleep, Thornton took the first watch, his mind working through what he had learned. Mercer wasn't just a cruel scientist pursuing escaped subjects. He was a father hunting down his own child, viewing her as both offspring and experiment. The thought made Thornton's decision crystallize with newfound clarity. This was no longer just about helping Nahimana rescue her daughter. It was about saving Helona from a fate worse than death, a life as a specimen under her own father's cold, clinical eye. Whatever it took, whatever price had to be paid, Thornton would ensure that didn't happen. Even if it meant confronting the bullet lodged near his heart and the death he had once sought but now wished fervently to postpone. In the flickering firelight, he watched Nahimana and Helona sleeping side by side, the mother's arm protectively encircling her child, even in slumber. Something inside him shifted, a decision forming without conscious thought. These two had become his purpose, his reason for continuing, and he would defend that purpose with his last breath, if necessary. They rose before dawn, moving out under stars that still glittered coldly in the western sky. Elena led them deeper into the llano, following routes known only to her people, seeking both progress westward and concealment from their pursuers. Helona rode silently with her mother, occasionally dozing against Nahimana's chest, but mostly watching the landscape with alert, wary eyes. The child's resilience was remarkable, Thornton thought, though he wondered what scars she carried beneath that composed exterior. By mid-morning, the sun beat down mercilessly from a cloudless sky, the flat terrain offering no respite from its glare. They were traversing the heart of the llano, now a vast tableland, with few landmarks, water sources, few and far between. "How much farther to the next water?" Thornton asked as they paused briefly to rest the horses. Elena pointed westward. "A half-day's ride. A spring in a small canyon my grandmother showed me as a child." Jenkins, who had been scanning the horizon behind them, spoke up. "We may have company before then. Dust cloud to the southeast. Moving fast." Thornton followed his gaze, spotting the telltale haze that marked mounted riders pushing their horses hard. "How many? Can't tell from this distance," Jenkins replied. "But they're following our trail, no doubt about that." They mounted again, pushing their already tired horses to greater speed. But Thornton knew it was only a matter of time. Their pursuers had fresher mounts, no child to consider, and the advantage of desperation, Mercer would drive his men relentlessly. As the sun reached its zenith, the terrain began to change subtly, the flat plain giving way to more broken country, low mesas, shallow ravines, scattered rock formations that offered both navigation challenges and potential defensive positions. "The spring is just beyond that ridge," Elena said, pointing to a line of higher ground ahead. "If we can reach it before they catch up, we'll have water and a defensible position." They urged their horses forward, but the animals were struggling now, the heat and pace taking their toll. Behind them, the dust cloud grew larger, resolving gradually into individual riders, 7 of them moving in tight formation. "We won't make it," Jenkins said grimly. "Not all of us together." Thornton saw the truth of it immediately. Their horses were spent while their pursuers were gaining steadily. A plan formed in his mind, desperate but possibly effective. "Elena," he said, "can you guide Nahimana and Helona to the spring if Jenkins and I hold them off?" Elena nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Yes, it's not far now." "Then that's what we do," Thornton decided. "Jenkins and I will find a good position here, delay them as long as possible. You three go ahead, get to water and safety." Nahimana's eyes widened. "No, we stay together." "There's no time to argue," Thornton said more sharply than he intended. His voice softened as he continued, "Helona needs water safety. You need to be with her. Jenkins and I can slow them down, maybe discourage them entirely." "It's the right move," Jenkins confirmed. "Military tactics, Nahimana. Divide their attention, reduce their advantage." Nahimana looked torn, her eyes moving from Thornton to the approaching riders and back. "You will follow as soon as possible." "As soon as we can," Thornton promised, knowing it might be a promise he couldn't keep, but needing to make it nonetheless. With visible reluctance, Nahimana nodded. "Be careful," she said, her eyes holding Thornton's for a moment longer than necessary. Then she turned to Elena. "Lead us to the spring." As the three rode westward toward the ridge, Thornton and Jenkins quickly surveyed the terrain, selecting a rocky outcropping that offered both cover and a good field of fire. They positioned their horses in a sheltered spot behind the rocks, then prepared their weapons, Jenkins with his Winchester rifle, Thornton with his Army Colt, and a shotgun from Jenkins' saddlebags. "Just like old times, eh, Lieutenant?" Jenkins remarked with grim humor as they settled into position. "Let's hope not," Thornton replied. "Too many didn't walk away from those old times." They didn't have long to wait. Within 20 minutes, the pursuing riders came into clear view, 6 men in dusty range clothes, all armed, led by a figure Thornton recognized immediately, despite the distance. Dr. Calvin Mercer, his straight-backed posture unmistakable, even on horseback. "Seems the good doctor likes to oversee his work personally," Jenkins observed. "Makes our job simpler," Thornton said. "We only need to discourage one man. The rest are likely hired guns with no personal stake in this." As the riders approached to within 100 yards, Jenkins raised his rifle and fired a warning shot that kicked up dust just ahead of the lead horses. The group pulled up sharply, the hired men reaching for weapons while Mercer raised a hand to restrain them. "That's close enough," Thornton called out. "Next shot won't be a warning." And there was a moment of consultation among the riders. Then Mercer moved his horse forward alone, stopping at a more conversational distance, though still well out of effective pistol range. "Garrick," he called, "I know you're there with Jenkins. This doesn't have to end badly. I just want what's mine." "Nothing here belongs to you, Mercer," Thornton replied, not rising from his protected position. "You know that's not true." Mercer's voice carried clearly in the still air. "The woman and child are legal wards of the government under my supervision as director of the school. What you're doing is kidnapping, plain and simple." "What you're doing is torture," Jenkins shouted back. "We know what goes on in that place you call a school." Mercer seemed unperturbed by the accusation. "Science requires dedication, sometimes sacrifice. The knowledge gained benefits all humanity." "Save the speeches," Thornton cut in. "You're not getting the child or her mother. Turn around, ride back to your school, and forget you ever knew them." A cold smile spread across Mercer's face. "You don't understand what you're interfering with, Garrick. That child is special, unique. Her abilities under proper study could revolutionize our understanding of human perception." "She's a child," Thornton responded, "not a laboratory animal." "She's my child," Mercer said, his voice suddenly harder. My blood, my creation. Mine to study, to develop, to perfect. The naked possessiveness in his tone confirmed everything Nahimana had revealed. Mercer didn't see Halona as a human being, but as an experiment he had initiated a project he owned completely. "That's where you're wrong," Thornton said, raising his voice to ensure Mercer and all his men could hear. "She's a human being, her own person, and she's chosen freedom with her mother over captivity with you." Mercer's face darkened with anger. "She's a child. She doesn't get to choose. And that woman stole her from me, from important work that could benefit mankind." "Last warning, Mercer," Jenkins called out, the Winchester steady in his hands. "Turn around and leave. There's nothing for you here." Mercer stared at their position for a long moment, calculation evident in his expression. Then he turned his horse, rejoining his men. A heated discussion ensued, with Mercer gesturing emphatically, while several of the hired guns appeared to argue against whatever he was proposing. "They're not happy with him," Jenkins observed. "Hired guns want easy money, not a firefight against dug-in opposition." "Let's hope they talk some sense into him," Thornton replied, though he doubted Mercer was the type to be dissuaded once his mind was set. He was proven right moments later when Mercer suddenly spurred his horse forward, galloping not toward their position, but in a wide arc to the west toward the ridge where Nahimana, Halona, and Elena had gone. "He's trying to go around us," Jenkins exclaimed. "Get to the horses!" Thornton was already moving, but as he rose, a sharp, familiar pain lanced through his chest, so intense that he stumbled, falling to one knee. The bullet near his heart, dislodged by his sudden movement, was shifting, sending waves of agony through his upper body. Jenkins was at his side instantly. "Garrick, what is it?" "The bullet." Thornton gasped, fighting through the pain. "Moving. Give me a minute." But they didn't have a minute. The hired guns, seeing Mercer make his move, had begun to spread out some, following their employer, while others moved to engage Jenkins and Thornton directly. "Can you ride?" Jenkins asked urgently. Thornton nodded, forcing himself to his feet through sheer willpower. "Have to. Need to reach them before Mercer does." They made it to their horses just as the first shots from the hired guns began to pepper their position. Mounting was agony for Thornton, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through his chest. But the thought of Mercer reaching Nahimana and Halona first drove him beyond his physical limitations. They rode hard, taking a direct route toward the ridge, while Mercer's longer path gave them a slight advantage, despite their later start. Behind them, most of the hired guns had given up the pursuit, apparently unwilling to risk their lives further for whatever Mercer was paying them. But Mercer himself rode with manic determination, driving his horse relentlessly toward his goal. As they approached the ridge, Thornton spotted movement ahead. Nahimana on Sally emerging from behind a rock formation, clearly searching for them. When she saw them coming, relief washed over her face, quickly replaced by alarm, as she noticed Mercer approaching from her left. "Get back to Halona!" Thornton shouted, urging Thunder to greater speed, despite the horse's exhaustion. Nahimana hesitated for just a moment before wheeling Sally around and disappearing back behind the rocks. Thornton and Jenkins followed, pushing their mounts up the increasingly steep terrain toward what appeared to be a narrow canyon entrance. They rounded a final bend to find Elena standing guard at the canyon mouth, a rifle in her hands. Beyond her, the canyon widened slightly, a small spring bubbling from the rock face, creating a pool of precious water. Nahimana stood protectively before Halona, who pressed herself against the canyon wall, eyes wide with fear. "He's right behind us," Jenkins warned as they dismounted. "One man, but determined." Elena nodded grimly. "This is a good place to make a stand. One way and good visibility." Thornton moved to Nahimana and Helona despite the persistent pain in his chest. "Are you both all right?" Nahimana nodded, but Helona trembled visibly, her small face pale with terror. "She senses him," Nahimana explained quietly. "Whatever he did to her created a connection she feels when he's near." The implications were chilling, but there was no time to dwell on them. A horse's whinny announced Mercer's arrival at the canyon entrance, where Elena and Jenkins now stood side by side, weapons ready. "That's far enough, Doctor," Jenkins called out. "Turn around while you still can." Mercer's voice drifted into the canyon calm and reasonable despite the circumstances. "This is unnecessary, Sergeant. I'm alone now. My men have abandoned me, as you can see. I only want to talk." "Nothing to talk about," Jenkins replied. "The woman and child aren't going back with you. That's final." "Perhaps we could let them decide for themselves," Mercer suggested, "after I've explained the importance of the work, the benefits to science." "They've already decided," Elena said firmly. "Ride away, Doctor. There's nothing for you here." Thornton, standing with Nahimana and Helona deeper in the canyon, felt a sudden chill as Helona began to tremble more violently, her small hands clutching at her head. "He's in my head," she whispered, the same words she had spoken during her nightmare. "He's trying to make me come to him." Nahimana wrapped her arms around her daughter protectively, murmuring reassurances, but the child's distress only increased. "Make him stop," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "It hurts." Fury surged through Thornton, overwhelming even the pain in his chest. Whatever Mercer had done to this child, whatever connection he had established through his experiments, he was using it now in one final attempt to reclaim his subject. Without conscious thought, Thornton found himself moving toward the canyon entrance, the Colt revolver in his hand. Jenkins saw him coming and stepped aside, recognizing in his expression a decision that had been made. At the entrance, Thornton finally confronted Calvin Mercer face to face. The doctor sat on his lathered horse, appearing remarkably composed despite his desperate ride. His spectacles caught the sunlight, momentarily obscuring his eyes. "Garrick," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "I suspected you might be the one to come forward. Always the hero, even back in the war. How's that bullet feeling? Still causing trouble, I imagine." "Stop whatever you're doing to the child," Thornton said flatly, ignoring the taunt. "Now." A thin smile touched Mercer's lips. "I'm merely reminding her of our work together. The importance of it. Her special role." "You're hurting her," Thornton stated, "and I'm telling you to stop." "Or what?" Mercer challenged, his smile widening. "You'll shoot me, kill an unarmed man, a respected doctor and educator. What would the authorities make of that, I wonder?" Thornton raised the Colt, aiming it steadily at Mercer's chest, despite the pain radiating from his own. "I don't care about the authorities. I care about that child suffering because of whatever you've done to her mind. Whatever sick connection you've created." "Connection," Mercer repeated, a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "Yes, that's precisely it. A mental connection established through carefully controlled stimuli. Pain, yes, but also reward. Conditioning of the most sophisticated kind. She responds to my thoughts, Garrick. My will. The first successful demonstration of directed mental influence. Do you have any idea of the significance?" "I know it ends today," Thornton said quietly. "One way or another." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Mercer's face. "You can't stop progress, Garrick. The work is too important. The child is too valuable." "Her name is Helona," Thornton said, "and she's not yours anymore." With those words, something broke in Mercer's controlled facade. Rage contorted his features, and his hand moved swiftly to his coat, withdrawing a small Derringer pistol concealed there. "She is mine," he snarled, raising the weapon. "My blood, my creation." The Colt in Thornton's hand bucked once the report echoing off the canyon walls. Mercer's expression froze in surprise, the Derringer falling from suddenly lifeless fingers as a dark stain spread across his immaculate white shirt. For a moment, he remained upright in the saddle, staring at Thornton with disbelief. Then he toppled slowly to the side, hitting the ground with a dull thud that seemed to release something into the air, a tension, a malevolence that had pervaded the canyon without them fully realizing it. From behind him, Thornton heard a small, gasping cry of relief. He turned to see Halona sagging in her mother's arms, the terrible tension leaving her small body as if a cord had been cut. "It's gone," she whispered, wonder in her voice. "The hurt in my head. It's gone." Nahimana held her daughter close, tears streaming down her face as she looked at Thornton with gratitude beyond words. The confrontation was over. Mercer lay dead, his obsession ended by a single bullet. But as Thornton holstered his weapon, a familiar agony tore through his chest, far more intense than before. He staggered, would have fallen if Jenkins hadn't caught him. "Garrick, what is it?" the old sergeant asked, alarm clear in his voice. "The bullet," Thornton managed through gritted teeth, "near my heart. Think it's moving." The world began to dim around the edges as Jenkins eased him to the ground. He was vaguely aware of Nahimana rushing to his side, of her hands moving to open his shirt, of her voice calling his name with increasing urgency. As consciousness began to slip away, Thornton had a final crystal-clear thought. If this was the end, it was a better one than he had planned for himself those weeks ago in the snow. A more meaningful death than the lonely suicide he had contemplated on that hill beside Sarah and Matthew's graves. This end, if end it was, had purpose. Halona was free. Nahimana would raise her daughter in safety. The cycle of cruelty Mercer had perpetuated was broken. It was enough. More than enough. With that thought, Thornton Garrick surrendered to the darkness, the pain in his chest fading to a distant throb as the world fell away. Voices drifted through the darkness, distant at first, then gradually more distinct. A cool cloth on his forehead. The smell of herbs. Pain dull and throbbing, but no longer the sharp agony that had claimed him. Thornton opened his eyes, slowly blinking against even the dim light that filtered through what he gradually recognized as canvas, a tent, simply constructed but effective shelter. "He's awake," a woman's voice said. Elena's, he realized after a moment. Footsteps approached, and suddenly Nahimana's face appeared above him. Her dark eyes filled with concern, and something more relief, perhaps even joy. "You're still with us," she said softly, her hand gentle on his brow. Thornton tried to speak, found his throat too dry, and gratefully accepted the water she helped him sip. "How long?" he managed, after moistening his lips. 3 days, Nahimana replied. The bullet moved, caused bleeding inside. "I had to—" She hesitated, then continued. "I had to open the wound, find the bullet, stop the bleeding." Thornton's eyes widened slightly as the implication sank in. "You operated on me." Nahimana nodded, a hint of apology in her expression. "I was healer for my people. I have done such things before, though never so close to the heart." The bullet. In answer, she reached into a small pouch at her waist and withdrew an object, placing it in his palm. The misshapen lead ball that had lived near his heart since Chancellorsville, finally extracted after 15 years. "You saved my life." Thornton said, wonder in his voice. A ghost of a smile touched Nahimana's lips. You saved ours first. Thornton closed his fingers around the bullet, feeling its weight. The physical manifestation of the burden he had carried for so long, now removed both literally and figuratively. Where are we? He asked, becoming more aware of his surroundings. Safe, Nahimana assured him. Jenkins knew of a place, a settlement of those who live outside the law. Not good men, perhaps, but not friends to authority either. They've given us shelter while you heal. Halona? She is well. Nahimana said, her face softening at the mention of her daughter. Better each day. Whatever hold Mercer had on her mind died with him. She speaks more now, even smiles sometimes. Relief washed through Thornton, followed by a wave of exhaustion that must have shown on his face. Rest now, Nahimana instructed, her hand warm on his. We are safe, and you need to heal. There will be time for more words later. As she rose to leave, Thornton caught her hand. Nahimana, he said, his voice stronger despite his weakness. Thank you. She looked down at their joined hands, then back to his face. For what? For saving my life, he replied. For showing me it was worth saving. Something deep and profound passed between them in that moment, understanding connection possibility. Then Nahimana gently squeezed his hand before releasing it. Sleep, she said softly. Regain your strength. We have a long journey ahead. As Thornton drifted back into healing sleep, he was aware of a sense of peace he had not known since before the war. The bullet was gone, its weight literally and figuratively lifted from his heart. Mercer was dead, his threat ended. Nahimana and Halona were safe. And for the first time in years, Thornton Garrick had a future to contemplate rather than a past to mourn. 3 weeks later, Thornton stood on a ridge overlooking a small valley where a creek wound its way through grassland dotted with stands of oak and pine. The late spring sun warmed his face as he surveyed what Jenkins had declared was good land worth settling. Behind him, Nahimana approached her footsteps, nearly silent on the grassy ground. It's beautiful, she said, coming to stand beside him. Reminds me of the lands where my people lived before. Jenkins says it's far enough from any settlement that we won't be bothered, Thornton replied, but close enough to friendly territory if we need supplies or help. They had traveled far since leaving the outlaw camp where Thornton had recovered from his surgery. Jenkins and Elena had accompanied them to the border of the Indian Territory, where they had parted ways, Jenkins and his niece heading north to rejoin Marion, while Thornton, Nahimana, and Halona continued westward, seeking a place where they could begin anew. This valley, nestled in a remote corner of territory, still largely ignored by settlers, seemed ideal. Water grazing, land timber for building, and most importantly, isolation from those who might recognize them or ask questions about a white man traveling with an Apache woman and child. Halona likes it here, Nahimana said, nodding toward the creek below, where her daughter sat playing with stones and sticks, constructing something with the serious concentration only children can bring to such tasks. She says the water sings good songs. Thornton smiled at that. In the weeks since Mercer's death, Halona had gradually emerged from her shell of silence and fear, revealing glimpses of the child she might have been without those years of captivity. She remained cautious, especially around strangers, but with her mother, and increasingly with Thornton, she showed curiosity, intelligence, and occasional flashes of joy that transformed her solemn face. I was thinking we could build there, Thornton said, pointing to a level spot near the creek, but above the flood line. Good drainage protected from north winds by that ridge water close by. We eat it. Nahimana asked the question, carrying more weight than the single word might suggest. Thornton turned to face her directly. "If you want," he said carefully, "if you and Helona would like to stay with me." They had not spoken directly of the future during their journey, focused as they were on immediate safety and Thornton's recovery. But something had been growing between them, unspoken but undeniable, a connection forged in shared danger and mutual respect, deepening into something more complex and profound. Nahimana studied his face, her dark eyes thoughtful. "What are you asking Thornton Garrick?" He took a deep breath, finding himself more nervous than he had been facing Mercer's gun. "I'm asking if you would consider making a home here. Together. The three of us." "As what?" She pressed her directness, both challenging and refreshing. "As companions, partners, or something else." "As family," Thornton said simply. "If you'll have me." Nahimana's expression softened, but she didn't rush to answer. "My people have a saying, 'The strongest lodges are built slowly with care for each pole and binding.' Mine say something similar," Thornton replied with a small smile. "Measure twice, cut once." "We have been through much together," Nahimana acknowledged. "But there is more to building a life than surviving danger." "I know," Thornton agreed, "and I'm not asking for an answer today. Only that you consider it. That you give us time to see what might grow here in this new place." Nahimana turned her gaze back to the valley to where Helona now stood at the creek's edge, watching something in the water with rapt attention. "She trusts you," she said quietly. "That is rare after what she has endured, and precious to me." "She's an extraordinary child," Thornton said. "She deserves a life of safety, of freedom, to become whoever she chooses to be." "And you would help provide that, even knowing what she is, who her father was?" "Mercer may have sired her," Thornton replied firmly, "but he was never her father in any way that matters. A father protects, nurtures, loves. He did none of those things." Nahimana nodded, accepting the truth of his words. "And you would be those things to her?" "I would try," Thornton promised. "Every day, for both of you." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of the creek below, the rustle of grass in the gentle breeze, the distant call of a hawk circling above. Then, with deliberate movements, Nahimana reached for the leather pouch she still wore around her neck. She opened it carefully and withdrew the lock of Helona's hair that she had carried for 3 long years of separation. "When they took her from me," she said softly, "this was all I had. A remembrance, a promise to myself that I would find her again." She looked up at Thornton, her eyes bright with emotion. "Now that promise is fulfilled. She is with me, safe, free." With gentle movements, she returned the lock of hair to the pouch, securing it once more. "Perhaps it is time for new promises," she continued. "New beginnings." Hope rose in Thornton's chest, tentative but growing. "Is that a yes?" "It is a beginning," Nahimana replied, a smile finally breaking across her face like sunrise. "We will build slowly with care. But yes, Thornton Garrick, we will build together." Before he could respond, a small voice called from below. "Mother, come see what I found." They looked down to see Helona waving excitedly, pointing at something in the creek. The child's face, so often solemn and wary, was alight with discovery and the simple joy of finding something new and wonderful. "Come," Nahimana said, extending her hand to Thornton. "Our daughter is calling." He took her hand, feeling its strength and warmth, and together they descended the ridge toward Helona and whatever treasure she had discovered. As they walked, Thornton felt the weight of the extracted bullet in his pocket, a reminder of the past he carried but was no longer defined by. Ahead lay a new path, one he had never expected to find, when a desperate woman had knocked on his cabin door during a blizzard, seeking warmth for a single night. Life, Thornton reflected, sometimes offered second chances. The wisdom lay in recognizing them when they appeared, and in finding the courage to accept them when they did. As they reached Helona, who excitedly showed them a tiny turtle she had found along the creek bank, Thornton knew with certainty that this was such a chance, a new beginning for three souls who had survived darkness and emerged against all odds into light. The land around them was wild, untamed, full of both challenges and possibilities. Like the future they would build together, step by careful step.